The wind in the north of Britannia was never truly silent. Even on the calmest days, a low, mournful breeze whispered through the long grass and over the stone battlements of the fortress. It was a cold wind, carrying the scent of damp earth, pine resin, and the distant tang of the sea. For the soldiers stationed at Eberacum, the place we now call York, this wind was a constant companion, a reminder that they were far from the olive groves and sun-drenched marble of Rome. Here, at the very edge of the known world, the air itself felt wild, untamed, and ancient. It was the early 2nd century, a time when the Roman Empire was at the zenith of its power, its golden arms stretching from the sands of Syria to the misty moors of Britain. And here, in the northern command, sat the 9th Legion Hispana, the Spanish Legion. They were the iron fist of the emperor in the north, a legendary fighting force whose very name commanded respect and fear. But before the mystery, before the mist swallowed them whole, there was simply the reality of the garrison. There was the routine, the discipline, and the overwhelming, tangible presence of Roman order imposed upon a chaotic land. Eberacum stood as a testament to that order. It was not merely a camp. It was a city of war, built with the geometric precision that defined the Roman mind. The fortress was a vast rectangle of stone and timber, sitting near the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss. From high above, it looked like a rigid grid stamped onto the rolling green hills, a stark contrast to the winding tracks and scattered roundhouses of the local Brigantist tribes. The day began not with a shout, but with the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the caligae, the hobnailed sandals of the legionaries striking the paved roads. It was a sound that echoed through the mist, a heartbeat of iron and leather. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and oil used to polish weapons. The men of the 9th were rising, moving with the practiced efficiency of veterans. These were men who had served under the standard of the bull, the emblem of their legion, for years. They came from all corners of the empire, from the sun-baked plains of Hispania, from Gaul, even from Italy itself. But here, in the shadow of the eagle, they were a single breathing entity. To understand the tragedy that would follow, we must first understand the pride of the 9th. This was not a garrison of fresh recruits or disgraced soldiers. The Legio IX Hispana was one of the oldest and most prestigious units in the imperial army. They traced their lineage back to the Republic, to the civil wars that had forged the empire. They had marched with Julius Caesar. They had fought in the Cantabrian Wars of Spain, earning their title, Hispana. They had been in Britannia since the very beginning of the conquest, wading onto its shores almost 70 years prior. They had even suppressed the rebellion of the fearsome Queen Boudica, suffering heavy losses but surviving to rebuild and fight again. Their history was one of triumph and resilience. In the center of the fortress, in the Principia or headquarters building, the soul of the legion was kept safe. The aquila of the eagle. It was more than a symbol. To a Roman legionary, the eagle was the embodiment of the legion's honor, made manifest in gold. It rested on a tall pole, its wings spread as if ready to take flight, grasping thunderbolts in its talons. In the flickering light of the shrine's oil lamps, the gold seemed to glow with an inner fire, warm and reassuring against the northern chill. Every soldier in Eberacum knew that as long as the eagle stood, the legion lived. To lose the eagle was a shame worse than death. It was the erasure of honor, the end of everything they stood for. Generals like Quintus Petilius Ceriolus had turned Eberacum into a formidable base. The walls were being upgraded from timber to stone, rising white and stark against the gray sky. Watchtowers punctuated the perimeter, where sentries stood wrapped in thick red cloaks, their breath pluming in the cold air as they scanned the horizon. To the south lay the safety of the province, the straight Roman roads leading back to Londinium and eventually to Rome itself. But to the north lay the wild lands, Caledonia, a place of jagged mountains, dense forests, and fierce painted tribes who refused to bow to the might of the empire. It was from this untamed wilderness that the cold wind blew, a constant whisper of the dangers that lurked just beyond the Roman frontier. The men of the 9th were warriors, but they were also builders and administrators. During the day, The fortress buzzed with activity. Blacksmiths hammered out new spearheads in the forges, their ringing blows a constant rhythm of industry. Carpenters shaped timber for new barracks, while stonemasons meticulously cut and laid the blocks for the fortress walls. Scribes in the administrative offices scratched away on wax tablets, managing pay, supplies, and orders that kept this vast military machine running. Life was a relentless cycle of duty. Morning drills in the training fields, patrol duty along the frontier roads, and guard shifts on the cold battlements. There was a sense of purpose here, a shared belief that they were holding back the chaos, extending the light of civilization into the darkness. Yet, an undercurrent of tension was always present. The local tribes, while officially subdued, were never truly conquered. Their resentment simmered just beneath the surface. Small raids on supply convoys were common, and lone legionaries who wandered too far from the fortress sometimes disappeared without a trace. The men of the knew they were occupiers in a hostile land. Their discipline was their shield, their comrades were their strength. In the evenings, they would gather in the taverns that had sprung up outside the fortress walls, drinking weak, watered-down wine and sharing stories of home. Their laughter a brief defiance against the encroaching gloom. They gambled with dice, sang songs from their homelands, and wrote letters to loved ones they might never see again. These were the moments of humanity that sustained them through the harsh realities of their service. The commander of the Legion, whose name is lost to history, would have felt the immense pressure of his position. Responsible for thousands of men and the security of the entire northern frontier, he would have spent his days planning, receiving intelligence from scouts, and sending reports back to the provincial governor. He knew that the peace was fragile. The tribes of Caledonia were uniting, their raids becoming bolder, more coordinated. Whispers of a great war leader, a new Calcacus, were carried on the wind. The Ninth Legion, the shield of Britannia, was being tested. Their reputation preceded them. They were known for their aggression and their tenacity. They had faced down enemies in every corner of the empire and had always emerged, perhaps bloodied, but never broken. This deep-seated pride, this unshakable belief in their own invincibility, may have been their greatest strength, but it was also to become their fatal flaw. They looked north, not with fear, but with a warrior's anticipation. They were the IX Hispana. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. And so, the stage was set. In the fortress of Eberocum, the Legion stood ready, its golden eagle gleaming in the heart of the camp. The men were confident, their discipline honed by years of service. The wind from Caledonia whispered of gathering storms, of painted warriors, and the promise of a battle that would echo through the ages. The Ninth Legion was about to march from the pages of history and into the mists of legend. They were about to face their final test, an encounter from which they and their sacred eagle would never return. What happened to this elite fighting force? How could nearly 5,000 of Rome's finest soldiers simply vanish? Life in the Roman fort of Eberocum was a cycle of endless preparation. The training grounds outside the walls were churned into mud by the constant drilling of troops. On any given morning, you'd hear the dull thud of wooden swords striking posts. The centurion's men with faces weathered like old leather and voices like grinding gravel walked the lines, correcting the stance, adjusting the shield. Shields up! Lock the line! Their commands would drift across the misty fields. The Ninth Legion practiced the testudo, the tortoise formation, overlapping their curved shields to create an impenetrable shell of wood and iron. They hurled their heavy javelins, the pila, with synchronized grunts, watching them arc through the gray sky to pierce targets with terrifying force. They were perfecting the art of violence, honing their bodies into weapons. Yet there was a calmness to it. This was not the chaotic frenzy of battle. It was the methodical work of professionals. It was the labor of the Legion. Inside the fort, the civilian settlement had grown up around the walls. It was a bustling, noisy place, smelling of roasting meat, baking bread, and tanned hides. Merchants from Gaul sold wine in amphoras sealed with wax. Local traders brought furs and grain. Soldiers, when off duty, would wander these muddy streets, spending their silver denarii on warm food or a game of dice. There was a sense of permanence here. A soldier might think, this is where I serve. This is where I live. And one day, when my 25 years are done, this is where I might retire. But beneath this bustling daily life, there was a tension. It lived in the glances officers exchanged when couriers arrived on foaming horses from the south. It lived in the rumors that flew through the bathhouse steam. The north was not quiet. The tribes of Caledonia, the painted men beyond the river Forth, were not submitting. They didn't fight like the Gauls, in great open armies that could be shattered by a cavalry charge. They fought like ghosts. They struck from the mist and vanished into the heather. In the officers' mess, the tribunes, young aristocrats serving their military time before entering politics in Rome, drank spiced wine and discussed strategy. They spoke of the rugged terrain ahead, of the glens and lochs that no map accurately depicted. They spoke of the cold that seeped into the bones and rusted the iron of their armor if not constantly oiled. The emperor desires a finality to the northern border, one might say, tracing a finger through the condensation on a silver goblet. Rome cannot tolerate an open door. The rank-and-file soldiers felt it differently. They felt it in the changing seasons. As autumn deepened, the shadows stretched longer across the parade ground. The fogs rolled in off the river Ouse, thick and white, lingering until noon. It was a blanket that obscured the world, turning the mighty stone walls of Ebracum into an island floating in a sea of white. One particular evening, the atmosphere was especially heavy. The sun had set early, bleeding a bruised purple light across the horizon before surrendering to the dark. Torches were lit along the main street of the camp, casting dancing shadows against the barrack walls. The smoke from thousands of cooking fires formed a haze that trapped the heat and the noise of the army. In the barracks of the first cohort, the most elite soldiers of the Legion, the mood was reflective. These men were the veterans, the backbone of the Ninth. They sat on their bunks, polishing their kit. A soldier named Lucius, a veteran of 15 years, ran an oiled rag over the cheek guards of his helmet. The metal shone under his careful hand. He checked every buckle, ensuring it was secure. Next to him, a younger legionary, barely 20, sharpened his gladius, the short stabbing sword that had conquered the world. The scrape, scrape, scrape of the whetstone was a hypnotic rhythm, a lullaby of war. They spoke of small things, the quality of that week's grain ration, a letter from a sister in Narbonne, new boots that were pinching a toe. They didn't speak of the grand strategy of the empire. They didn't speak of glory. They spoke of the things that tethered them to reality. But they all knew the rumors were true. The Legion was being readied. The stores were being packed. The blacksmiths were working double shifts, repairing wagons and shoeing mules. The 9th Legion Hispana was a sleeping giant, and it was waking up. Ebracum, for all its stone and strength, was merely a cage for the bull, and the beast was restless. The soldiers could feel it in the vibrations of the ground as cavalry squadrons practiced maneuvers on the floodplains. They could hear it in the blare of the horns that signaled the night's watches. That night, a heavy silence fell over the fort as the hour grew late. The noise of the settlement faded. The only sounds were the measured footsteps of the sentries on the ramparts and the crackle of the braziers keeping the night chill at bay. High above the gatehouse, the Roman standard flapped lazily in the shifting wind. The eagle of the night looked north, into the darkness where clouds hid the stars. It's easy, looking back through history, to see the tragedy hanging over Ebracum like a shroud. But for the men sleeping in those barracks, wrapped in their rough wool blankets, there was no tragedy yet. There was only the soldier's life. The camaraderie of the mess tent, the weight of the shield, the trust in the man standing next to you. They were the masters of their world. They were the 9th. They had never met a foe they could not break. As the night deepened, the fog began to rise from the river again. It crept over the ditch and the rampart, curling around the stone pillars of the gate. It moved silently like a scout for an approaching army, testing the defenses. It dampened the sounds of the night, muting the footsteps, softening the edges of the world. Inside the headquarters, the golden eagle gleamed in the dim light, watching. It had seen the suns of Spain and the forests of Germany. Now, it watched the mists of Britannia. The Legion was at its peak, powerful, equipped, and disciplined. They were the pride of the Empire, stationed at the very edge of civilization, a beacon of Rome's enduring light. But light, no matter how bright, is always surrounded by darkness. And the darkness of the North was vast, ancient, and patient. The men of the Ninth slept, dreaming of home, dreaming of honor, unaware that they were spending their final days in the safety of the known world. The stone walls of Ebercombe felt permanent, indestructible. But history is not written in stone. It is written in the movement of people, and the Ninth was about to move. Just the cold, wet wind of Britannia blowing from the north, from the mystery that awaited them all. The stage was set. The players were ready. The pride of the Empire was prepared to march. The command didn't start with a shout in the courtyard of Ebercombe. It began months before, thousands of miles away, in the marble halls of Rome. It began with a whisper in an emperor's ear, a quill scratching on papyrus, and the drip of red wax onto a scroll. That wax, stamped with the imperial seal, hardened into an order that would travel across the spine of the world. It was carried by ship across the turbulent English Channel, then by a relay of exhausted horses thundering up the straight stone-paved roads of Britannia. It passed through the bustling streets of Londinium, through the dark forests of the Midlands, until finally it arrived at the heavy oak gates of the northern fortress. The arrival of a courier was common in Ebercombe, but this one felt different. The horse was lathered in sweat, its breath pluming in the cold morning air like smoke from a dragon's nostrils. The rider, mud-spattered and gray-faced with fatigue, didn't stop at the lower barracks. He rode straight for the Praetorium, the commander's residence. Legionaries watching from their posts leaned on their spears, pausing their duties. They knew the look of urgent news. And in the Roman army, news from the south rarely meant rest. It meant movement. Inside, the legate of the Ninth Legion broke the seal. The room was warm, hid by the hypocaust system beneath the floor, a luxury that felt like a distant memory the moment you stepped outside. As he unrolled the scroll, the scent of dry papyrus mixed with the burning cedar in the brazier. He read the words in silence. The Latin was formal, precise, and unforgiving. There was unrest in the north. Beyond the line of the forts, beyond the reach of tax collectors and road builders, the tribes of Caledonia were stirring. They weren't gathering for a pitched battle Rome could crush a pitched battle. No, they were raiding, burning, and vanishing into the mist. They were mocking the authority of the eagle. The emperor's patience was gone. The order was simple in its phrasing, but colossal in its implication. March north. Pacify the region. Establish the limit of the empire. The legate rolled the scroll back up. He looked out the narrow window at the gray sky hanging over his fortress. To march into Caledonia wasn't like marching into Gaul or Spain. It was to march off the edge of the map. It was a land of endless glens, deep black locks, and mountains that tore at the clouds. It was a place where the very formations that made the Legion strong could be broken by the terrain itself. But the command was absolute. The Ninth would march. The news filtered down through the ranks like water seeping through stone. First to the tribunes, the young aristocrats who saw this as a chance for glory. Then to the centurions, the hardened career soldiers who saw it for what it was, a logistical nightmare and a test of survival. Finally, it reached the barracks. "We move," the Optio announced, his silhouette framed by the dull light in the doorway of the barrack block. "Prepare the kit. Full march readiness by the Ides." There was no cheering. There was no groaning. There was only the immediate disciplined shift in atmosphere. The soldiers of the Ninth were professionals. They didn't question the why. They focused entirely on the how. The preparation for a campaign is a ritual of its own, a slow, methodical dance of maintenance and supply. For the next several days, the fortress of Ebracum transformed. The air grew thick with the sounds of industry. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of the blacksmith's hammers rang out from dawn until deep into the night, sparks flying in the smithy like swarms of fireflies. Every piece of equipment had to be perfect. A legionary's life depended on the integrity of his gear. In the barracks, men sat on low wooden stools, working with quiet intensity. The Larica Segmentata, iconic segmented armor, was taken apart, strip by metal strip. Rust, the eternal enemy in this damp climate, was scoured away with sand and vinegar. Leather straps, brittle from the cold, were replaced or soaked in neat's foot oil until they were supple and dark. The very smell of the camp changed. It now smelled of hot iron, boiled leather, and sharpening stones. The grinding wheel turned constantly. She, the sound of a gladius being honed to a razor edge. A dull sword could mean death, so the men worked the steel until it could slice a hair floating in the air. The tips of the pila, the heavy javelins, were checked to ensure their soft iron shanks would bend upon impact, making them useless to the enemy, but deadly in the first volley. In the granaries, the activity was frantic. A legion moves on its stomach, and the ninth was a beast with a ravenous appetite. Enormous sacks of grain were hauled from dry lofts and loaded on the heavy wooden wagons. Amphorae of wine, sour vinegar for purifying water, and salted pork were tallied and packed. The oxen, great lumbering beasts with steam rising from their broad backs, were yoked and tested. The mules, the unsung heroes of the Roman army, were inspected for limps or sores. Every 8-man tent group was assigned a mule to carry their heavy leather, tent, and the stone mill for grinding their daily grain. It was a study in logistics, a testament to the organizational genius of Rome. Thousands of men, thousands of animals, and tons of supplies were being orchestrated into a single cohesive unit. Quartermasters moved through the camp with wax tablets, ticking off lists, arguing over counts of nails and spare sandal straps. But amidst all this hustle, a psychological shift was occurring. The men were mentally leaving the comfort of Ebracum. They were detaching from the warmth of the hearth and the familiar taverns. In the evenings, as the work slowed, talk in the barracks turned to the destination. Caledonia. The name itself held a dark magic. I heard the trees there are so thick you can't see the sky for days, a young recruit whispered, rubbing grease into his shield cover. It's not the trees you need to worry about, an older veteran replied, his voice raspy from years of shouting orders. It's the bog, the ground that swallows a man whole if he steps wrong. And the silence. It's too quiet up there. They spoke of the enemy, the tribes who painted themselves blue with woad, who fought naked in the snow, screaming like banshees. To the Roman mind, which valued order, geometry, and civilization, the Caledonians represented pure chaos. They were the other, the wild things that lived beyond the wall of civilization. The soldiers checked their good luck charms, bronze amulets, carvings of gods, small tokens from home. They prayed to Mars for strength, to Mithras for courage, and to the obscure local gods of the north for mercy. The great machine of the Ninth Legion was almost ready. Soon, the gates of Ebracum would swing open, and they would march north into the mist and into history. The political backdrop of this march was not lost on the officers. They knew that Rome was overextended. The empire was vast, perhaps too vast. This expedition wasn't just about suppressing a rebellion. It was a show of force intended to echo through the ages. The emperor needed a victory. He needed the map to look clean. The Ninth Legion was the eraser being sent to wipe away the messy edges of the frontier. As the day of departure approached, the weather turned. The sky lowered, pressing down on the fort like a gray wool blanket. A steady, freezing drizzle began to fall, turning the training grounds into a slick of mud. It was a grim omen, perhaps, or simply the reality of life in Britain. The soldiers looked at the rain and checked their pianula cloaks. Thick wool meant to shed water. They knew that for the next few months, they would likely never be truly dry. On the final night, Ebracum was eerily quiet. The packing was done. The wagons were loaded and covered with oilcloths. The armor was polished and stacked. The men lay in their bunks, staring up at the timber ceilings they might never see again. The laughter and gambling of previous nights were gone. In their place was a contemplative silence. Each man was making his peace with the known world. The legate stood on the balcony of the Praetorium, looking over his legion. He saw the rows of darkened barracks, the glow of the watchfires on the walls, and the silhouette of the eagle standard waiting in the shrine. He felt the immense weight of command. 5,000 lives were in his hands. 5,000 stories, families, and futures. He was leading them into a void. Maps of the north were mostly guesswork blank spaces filled with drawings of mountains and warnings. Hixon Tracones, here be dragons. He went back inside and poured a cup of watered wine. He looked at the bust of the emperor on his desk. To the unknown, he whispered, raising the cup in a solitary toast. The morning of the march arrived not with the sun, but with a lightening of the gray gloom. The trumpet sounded the cornu with its deep, mournful curve and the sharp, brassy blast of the tuba. The sound cut through the mist, jarring the men from their sleep. Up! Up! Move it! The barracks erupted into controlled chaos. Sandals were laced tight. Armor was buckled. Helmets were donned, the cheek guards snapping into place. Shields were hoisted. The heavy marching packs, the sarsna, were lifted onto shoulders, weighted down with rations, tools, and cooking pots. They assembled on the Via Principalis, the main road running through the camp. Cohort by cohort, century by century, they fell into formation. It was a forest of iron and red plumes. The centurions walked the lines, their vine staffs in hand, checking the spacing. Eyes front, silence in the ranks. The gates of Ebercum groaned open. The heavy timber doors swung wide, revealing the road that stretched north. It was a straight line of Roman engineering, cutting through the green hills, leading away from the safety of the stone walls. The command was given. Forward, march! The sound was like thunder. Thud, thud, thud. Thousands of hobnailed sandals struck the stone simultaneously. The 9th Legion Hispana began to move. The eagle was lifted high, catching the dull light, bobbing above the heads of the men. As they marched out of the gate, they passed the civilians, the wives, the merchants, the children of the canabe. There were no cheers, only a solemn watching. Some women wept silently, holding their hands to their mouths. The merchants looked worried, wondering if their best customers would ever return. The soldiers did not look left or right. They looked straight ahead, their faces set in masks of stoic determination. They left the fortress behind. They left the warmth of the fires. They marched past the burial grounds that lined the road outside the city, where the tombstones of fallen soldiers stood as silent sentinels. Dismanibus to the spirits of the departed. It was a reminder of mortality. The column was miles long, a snake of iron winding its way into the landscape. The rumble of the wagons, the creak of leather, and the rhythmic tramping of feet created a hypnotic soundscape. They were a machine of war, perfect and terrible. But as they crested the first hill and Eberacum disappeared from view behind them, the landscape seemed to open up, vast and indifferent. The road ahead was empty, the mist clung to the valleys. The 9th Legion was no longer a garrison. It was a wanderer. The Emperor's command had been obeyed. They had stepped off the edge of their world and into the pages of a mystery that would last for 2,000 years. The march into the unknown had begun. The sound of the world changed first. For days, the rhythm of the march had been defined by the sharp, authoritative clack-clack of hobnailed sandals striking paved stone. The Roman road, that great artery of the empire, had carried them north with a reassuring solidity. It was a straight line of civilization, an arrow of order shot through the heart of the countryside. But then, as the sun climbed to its highest point behind a veil of gray clouds, the stone ended. There was no grand gate marking the boundary, no statue of Terminus, the god of borders. There was simply the moment where the engineered causeway of the Romans dissolved into the dark, packed earth of the ancient trackways. The sound of the march softened instantly. The sharp clatter was replaced by a dull, rhythmic thudding, the sound of iron and leather meeting mud and grass. The Ninth Legion had crossed the frontier. They had stepped off the map. To the soldiers, this transition was more than physical. It was deeply psychological. Behind them lay the network of forts, the warm bathhouses, the granaries filled with wheat from the sunny fields of Gaul. Behind them lay the law. Ahead, stretching out into the misty distance, lay Caledonia. It was a land that the maps in Rome depicted only as a vague, shapeless mass at the top of the world, often left blank or inscribed with warnings of monsters. The landscape began to transform around them. The gentle, rolling hills of the south, dotted with Roman villas and orderly farms, gave way to something far older and more primal. The trees here were different. They were not the manicured groves of the Mediterranean. They were ancient oaks with gnarled, twisted limbs covered in velvet moss. There were towering Scotch pines that stood like dark sentinels on the ridges, their needles whispering in the wind with a sound like rushing water. This was a world untouched by the Roman axe and plow, a land that had never felt the surveyor's chain or the architect's grid. The air itself felt different, colder, and heavier with the scent of damp earth, pine, and something else, something wild and ancient. The soldiers marched on in their disciplined columns, but they were no longer the masters of this domain. They were intruders, a river of red and iron flowing through a landscape that did not recognize their authority. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow that flickered at the edge of their vision, held a new weight. Was it just the wind? A deer? Or was it the Picts? The painted people they had been sent to conquer? The men grew quieter. The easy banter of the march gave way to a focused alertness. Their eyes scanned the dense forest and the empty hillsides, searching for threats they couldn't yet define. This wasn't just a military campaign anymore. It was a journey into a myth. The Ninth Legion was now a whisper in a vast, silent wilderness. As the column of 5,000 men snaked its way deeper into this territory, the sheer scale of the wilderness began to press in on them. The sky seemed vast here, a colossal dome of shifting gray and white that dwarfed the Legion. The clouds moved with a terrifying speed, driven by winds from the icy seas to the north, casting rapidly moving shadows across the heather-covered moors. The air grew colder. It was a damp, seeping cold that found its way through the layers of wool tunics and settled into the marrow of the bones. It smelled of wet earth, rotting leaves, and the sharp, clean scent of pine resin. It was the smell of a land that had never known the plow, a land that had been sleeping for 1,000 years. For the young recruits, those who had joined the Legion for the promise of silver and adventure, the initial feeling was one of awe mixed with a creeping dread. They looked at the dense forest flanking the path and felt small. In Rome, man dominated nature. Stone was cut, water was aqueducted, and forests were cleared. Here, nature was the dominant force. The Legion, for all its iron and discipline, looked like a fragile ribbon of red and silver winding through a vast green ocean. The column moved slowly, hampered by the terrain. The ground was uneven, hidden beneath knee-high ferns and thick entanglements of brambles. Every step had to be measured. The baggage train, the heavy wagons pulled by oxen, groaned and creaked as the wheels sank into soft patches of bog. The shouts of the drovers, usually sharp and commanding, seemed swallowed by the vastness of the open space. Keep the line. Watch your footing. The voices of the centurions lacked their usual echo. There were no stone walls to bounce the sound back. The commands drifted away on the wind, sounding thin and fragile. As they marched, the geography became more aggressive. Rocky crags jutted out of the earth, like the bones of the land, jagged and gray. Water was everywhere. Small streams, swollen by the relentless rains, cut across their path, forcing the engineers to hastily construct timber bridges or find fords. The water in these streams was not the clear blue of the south. It was dark, stained the color of tea by the peat of the moors. It flowed silently, deep and cold. The soldiers began to notice the silence. It wasn't a true silence. The wind was always there, and the cry of birds, but it was a lack of human noise. There was no distant hum of a city, no barking of farm dogs, no church bells or temple gongs. It was a heavy, watching silence. They passed the remnants of abandoned settlements. Round houses with thatched roofs that had collapsed in on themselves. The stone circles of hearths now cold and filled with weeds. There were no people. The tribes of the north had melted away before the advance of the iron machine. They had taken their cattle, their grain, and their families, retreating into the deep woods and the high glens. This absence was more unsettling than a visible army. It made the land feel haunted. It felt as though the hills themselves were watching the Romans, thousands of invisible eyes tracking every step. A veteran soldier, a man named Marcus, who had served in the deserts of Judea, shifted the weight of his pillar on his shoulder. He was used to the sun, to the heat that shimmered off the sand. This green, wet world was alien to him. He looked at the forest line, dark and impenetrable. "It breathes," he muttered to the man beside him. "The land here. It feels like it's breathing." His companion, a younger man from Gaul, nodded nervously. "It's too quiet. Where are they? Where are the painted men?" "They are here," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "They are the trees. They are the rocks. They don't need to show themselves." This was a psychological shift. In the fort, the enemy was a concept of barbarian to be conquered. Out here, beyond the frontier, the enemy was the environment itself. The soldiers began to feel a profound isolation. They were walking away from everything they knew. Every mile north was a mile further from help, a mile further from a warm bed, a mile further from sanity. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fail. In these northern latitudes, the twilight was long and blue. The sun didn't set so much as dissolve into the mist. The fog began to rise from the damp ground, curling around the ankles of the soldiers, softening the edges of the world. It turned the legion into a ghost army. The bright red of their tunics and the shine of their armor were muted to dull grays and browns. The order was given to make camp. This, at least, was a familiar ritual. The Romans carried their civilization with them. Every night, no matter where they were, they built a fort. It was a compulsion of order. The soldiers threw down their packs and took up their entrenching tools. They dug a ditch. They threw up an earth rampart. They drove stakes into the ground to form a palisade. It was a frantic effort to create a bubble of safety in the wilderness. But as they worked, digging into the wet, black soil of Scotland, they felt the resistance of the land. Roots tangled their shovels. Rocks blunted their pickaxes. It was hard work, harder than the training grounds of Eboracum. And as they built their walls, they couldn't help but look over their shoulders at the darkening horizon. The wall they built was waist-high, a flimsy barrier against the vast, encroaching night. When the fires were finally lit, they did not burn with the cheerful crackle of dry wood. The wood here was damp, and the fires hissed and popped, sending thick, stinging smoke into the eyes of the men. They sat around the flames, huddled in their cloaks, eating their ration of hardtack and bacon. Usually, a Roman camp is a noisy place of gambling, joking, and loud conversation. Tonight, the volume was low. The laughter was subdued. The darkness pressing against the perimeter of the torchlight felt absolute. Beyond the circle of light, there was nothing but the unknown. The sentries took their posts on the newly dug ramparts. They stared out into the blackness. Their world had shrunk to the few feet of ground illuminated by the fire. Everything else, the hills, the forests, the glens, belonged to something else. In the command tent, the legate studied his map by the light of an oil lamp. The map ended just a few inches past his finger. He looked at the empty parchment where the ink faded into nothingness. He was a man of logic, a man of Rome, but even he could feel the weight of this place. They had crossed the edge of the world. They were intruders in a temple of nature that did not want them there. The wind picked up again. It howled through the glen, a mournful, hollow sound. It sounded like a voice, ancient and sad, mourning the intrusion of iron into a world of wood and stone. The soldiers tried to sleep, listening to the wind beat against the leather of their tents. They closed their eyes and tried to remember the sun of Italy, the busy streets of Rome, the safety of the stone walls they had left behind. But the images were fading. All they could see, even behind closed eyelids, was the green, endless expanse of the north. All they could hear was the wind. They were the Ninth Legion Hispana, the conquerors of the world. But here, under the vast, indifferent sky of Caledonia, they did not feel like conquerors. They felt like trespassers. And the land was beginning to wake up around them. The march had only just begun, but the safety of the frontier was already a lifetime away. The wilderness had swallowed them, and for the first time, the eagle of the Ninth seemed small against the backdrop of the eternal, mist-shrouded hills. The deeper the Ninth Legion marched into the heart of Caledonia, the more the world seemed to contract. The vast open skies of the first few days, with their racing clouds and distant horizons, were gone. In their place, the landscape began to close in around them, tightening like a fist. The air grew heavier, laden with moisture that did not fall as rain, but hung suspended as a pervasive, clinging dampness. It was a change so subtle that the soldiers could not pinpoint the exact moment it happened, but they all felt it. The crisp, cold wind of the open moors had died, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. They had entered the Great Wood, the Caledonian forest. To a Roman soldier, raised on the sun-baked terraces of Italy or the open farmlands of Gaul, this forest was a nightmare made of vegetation. It was ancient, older than Rome, older than the Republic, perhaps older than mankind itself. The trees were colossal. Scots pines towered overhead, their rough, red-brown bark scaling like the skin of dragons, their needles forming a canopy so dense that it blotted out the sun. Beneath them grew gnarled oaks, covered in thick velvet moss that muffled every sound. The light here was different. It was a perpetual twilight, a submarine gloom of greens and grays. Rays of sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, appearing only as thin, pale shafts that illuminated dancing motes of dust before vanishing into the shadows. Time seemed to lose its meaning. Without the sun to mark the hours, the march became an endless, fluid grind. Morning bled into afternoon with no discernible change in the atmosphere. And then came the fog. It did not roll in like a weather front. It seemed to exhale from the earth itself. It rose from the sodden ground, curling around the roots of the trees, white and spectral. It was a cold mist, smelling of peat and decaying leaves. At first, it was just a haze at ankle height, swirling around the marching boots of the legionaries. But as the day wore on, it rose higher, consuming the legs, then the waist, and finally the heads of the men. The column of the Ninth Legion, usually a spectacle of rigid geometry, began to fragment visually. The soldier at the back of a sentry could barely see the man at the front. The bright red of their tunics was drained of color, turning a dull, muddy maroon. The gleam of their armor was extinguished, the iron coated in a layer of condensation that looked like sweat. This was where the unease truly began to set in. A Roman legion draws its strength from cohesion. They fight shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. They are a single organism, but the fog isolated them. It created a private world for each soldier, a small bubble of visibility that extended only a few feet in any direction. Inside that bubble, a man was alone with his thoughts and the rhythmic, muffled thud of his own footsteps. The silence of the forest was not empty. It was heavy. It was a silence that felt like a held breath. The usual sounds of a marching army, the clatter of equipment, the curses of the mule drivers, the banter between ranks died away. The men stopped talking. The forest demanded quiet, and instinctively, the soldiers obeyed. But it wasn't truly silent. There were sounds, but they were the wrong sounds. The wind, trapped beneath the canopy, didn't howl. It whispered. It moved through the high branches with a soft, sibilant hissing sound, like thousands of voices murmuring in a language no one could understand. Dead leaves rustled on the forest floor when there was no breeze to move them. Twigs snapped in the distance with the sharp crack of a whip, causing heads to snap around, eyes wide, searching the gray void. Every soldier became acutely aware of the weight of their gear, the familiar creak of their leather straps now an intrusion on the profound quiet. The rhythmic thump of thousands of caligae, the hobnailed sandals of the legionary, was swallowed by the damp earth and moss, leaving a disconcerting padded footfall. The centurions, men of iron will and unwavering discipline, found themselves glancing over their shoulders. Their commands, usually sharp and clear, came out clipped and low, as if they too were afraid to disturb whatever was listening in the gloom. The local guides, procured from allied tribes on the frontier, grew more sullen and withdrawn with each passing mile. They would point the way with tight, jerky gestures, their eyes constantly scanning the trees. They refused to enter certain groves, forcing the Legion to make long, time-consuming detours. When pressed for a reason by a frustrated Optio, a guide might only whisper of old spirits, of places where the veil between worlds was thin. These explanations were dismissed by the Roman officers as barbarian superstition, yet the fear was contagious. It seeped into the ranks like the mist itself. Men began to see things in the periphery of their vision. A flicker of movement in the dense undergrowth, a shadow that seemed to detach itself from a tree trunk and melt into another. Was it a deer? A boar? Or was it something else? The stories began to circulate in hushed tones during the brief, cheerless halts. A sentry on night watch swore he saw figures moving just beyond the light of the watchfires, figures too tall and thin to be men. Another soldier claimed to have heard his name whispered on the wind from a direction where no man stood. The forest was not just an obstacle. It felt like an entity. Its immense, ancient presence weighed on the minds of the soldiers. This was not the tame wilderness of Italy, with its sacred groves dedicated to familiar gods. This was something primeval, something that had never been touched by civilization, and it did not welcome them. The symbols of Rome, the polished eagles, and the imperial banners seemed absurdly out of place here. They were symbols of order and light in a realm of chaos and shadow. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had faced down charging cavalry and held the line against screaming barbarian hordes now started at the snap of a twig. The Legion, a machine built for conquest, was being slowly dismantled not by an enemy army, but by the land itself. The fear was different from the fear of battle. The fear of battle was a sharp, hot thing, a rush of adrenaline that could be channeled into violence. This was a cold, creeping dread that settled in the bones and chilled the soul. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of being lost, the fear of being watched by unseen eyes in a place that did not obey the rules of men. As the Ninth Legion pushed ever deeper into the Caledonian heart of darkness, they were no longer just marching. They were being hunted by the silence, stalked by the fog, and consumed by the ancient whispering woods. Their conquest was becoming a ghost story, and they were the ghosts. "Did you hear that?" A young legionary whispered, gripping his pilum until his knuckles were white. "Keep your eyes front," the veteran beside him growled, though his own eyes were darting to the periphery. "It's just a deer." "Or a wolf." "It didn't sound like a wolf," the boy replied. "It sounded like a footstep. The year is 83 AD. 3 Roman legions, more than 15,000 men, marched north into the misty highlands of Caledonia, what we now call Scotland. They are the 9th, the 20th, and the 2nd Adiatrix, a force of unparalleled military might, pushing the boundaries of the known world for the glory of Rome. But this was not the sun-scorched earth of Judea or the rolling fields of Gaul. This was a different kind of land. A land of deep, dark forests, of swirling fog, and of mountains that scraped the belly of the clouds. The feeling of being watched grew with every mile. It was a primal sensation, a prickling on the back of the neck that raised the fine hairs on their arms. The Romans were the apex predators of the ancient world. They were the hunters. But here, in this suffocating green labyrinth, the dynamic had shifted. They felt like prey. The indigenous tribes of Caledonia, the people the Romans called the Caledoni or the Picts, the painted ones, were masters of this terrain. They did not fight in open fields with bright uniforms and gleaming standards. They were ghosts. They wore the skins of animals and painted their bodies with wove, swirling patterns of blue that mimicked the shadows of the forest. They could stand perfectly still against the trunk of a pine tree, and a Roman soldier could look right at them and see nothing but bark and shadow. Their warfare wasn't just about ambush and skirmishes. It was a deeply psychological assault on the Roman mind. The legionaries, men of order and discipline, began to see things in the mist. A shape moving between the trees, was it a man? Or just a trick of the fog swirling around the branch? A flash of pale skin in the undergrowth, was it a face? Or a patch of white lichen on a rock? Sometimes, the scouts the explorators sent ahead of the main column would return with wide, frightened eyes. They reported finding symbols. Not forts, not armies, but signs. A ring of stones placed in the middle of the path. A deer's skull hung from a branch, facing the approaching legion, its antlers adorned with feathers. Strange carvings on the bark of the tree, spirals, and knots that seemed to ride when looked at out of the corner of the eye. These were not military defenses in the Roman sense. They were something far more insidious. They were psychological warfare. They were messages, written in the language of the wild, that said, "We see you. You do not belong here. This place is ours." The centurions, the heart and backbone of legionary discipline, tried to keep morale high. They marched up and down the lines, their voices cutting through the damp air. Ignore the shadows. It's superstition. Iron beats wood. Remember that. There is nothing in these trees that a Roman gladius cannot kill. But even the officers felt the weight of the woods. The legate, riding his horse near the center of the column, felt his beast shiver beneath him, its ears pinned back and its eyes rolling white with anxiety. The animals knew. The pack mules balked at crossing small streams, sensing something in the water that the men could not see. As the afternoon dragged on, the fog thickened into a soup. The world shrank to the man in front and the man behind. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to snap the crests of helmets or catch on the fabric of cloaks. The path, such as it was, became treacherous. Roots, slick with moss, waited to twist an ankle. Holes, hidden by ferns, waited to break a leg. The march slowed to a crawl, the rhythmic tramp of sandals replaced by curses and the sounds of men slipping and stumbling. In this sensory deprivation, the soldiers' minds began to play tricks on them. They were a long way from home, from the sun and wine of Italy. They remembered the stories told by the hearts in the frontier towns. Stories of the spirits of the north, of the Bean Nag, the ghostly washerwoman at the ford who washes the blood-stained clothes of those about to die, of the fairies who steal men away into the hollow hills for a century. Superstition, once dismissed, began to creep back into their thoughts. A soldier named Valerius, a sturdy man from the Apennine Mountains, found himself staring into the dense wall of pine needles to his left. He swore he saw eyes. Not animal eyes, which reflect light, but human eyes flat, dark, and filled with a cold, unnerving intelligence. He blinked, and they were gone. But the feeling remained, a cold knot in his stomach. "They are counting us," he murmured to himself. And he was right. They were being watched. From high in the branches, from deep within the fern brakes, from behind the ridges of mossy stone, the eyes of the north were upon them. The tribesmen were there, silent as the fog itself. They watched the metal snake wend its way through their home. They saw the heavy armor that made the men slow. They saw the wagons that could not maneuver. They saw the arrogance of the straight line trying to force its way through the curved, chaotic world of the forest. And they did not attack. Not yet. They were patient. They knew the forest better than the Romans knew their own barracks. They knew that the forest itself was their greatest ally. The relentless cold would sap the Romans' strength. The constant, gnawing fear would sap their will. The unforgiving terrain would break their formation. The tribes waited, shadowing the column like a pack of wolves trailing a wounded bison, waiting for the moment of greatest weakness. The psychological toll of this non-contact warfare was immense. In a traditional battle, you have a focal point for your adrenaline, the enemy in front of you. You scream, you strike, you release the tension. But here, there was no release. The adrenaline built up in the blood, turning into a toxic sludge of anxiety. Every shadow was a potential assassin. Every rustle of leaves was a potential ambush. The muscles remained tense, locked in a perpetual state of fight or flight, but with nothing to fight and nowhere to flee. This was the terror of the unseen enemy. As evening approached, the weak northern light faded completely, plunging the forest into a premature night. The order to halt was given. The sound of the command was swallowed instantly by the moss and the trees. "Form camp! Dig in!" The legionaries, exhausted in body and spirit, began the familiar back-breaking work of building a fortified marching camp. But even here, in their makeshift fortress of earth and wood, they felt no safety. They knew the eyes were still out there, in the impenetrable darkness beyond the flickering torchlight, watching and waiting. The Caledonian campaign will become one of the Roman Empire's most brutal and frustrating endeavors. A stark reminder that even the greatest military machine on earth could be brought to its knees not just by swords and spears, but by the power of the land and the terror of the unknown. That night, the digging of the ditch was frantic. The men worked with a desperate energy, throwing up the earth rampart as if their lives depended on it, which they felt they did. They wanted a wall, a barrier between them and the watching woods. When the fires were lit, the fog reflected the light, creating walls of orange haze around the camp. It felt less like a fortress and more like a cage. The light didn't push back the dark. It merely illuminated the mist, turning it into a glowing, impenetrable curtain. The soldiers sat close to the fires, their backs to the flames, facing outward into the gloom. They held their bowls of porridge, but many had lost their appetites. The forest was noisy now. Night brought out the nocturnal creatures, but to the strained ears of the legionaries, every hoot of an owl sounded like a signal whistle. Every crack of a branch sounded like a footstep. In the command tent, the maps were useless. The local guides they had hired looked nervous. They spoke in hushed tones to the legate. "The spirits are angry," one guide said, his eyes darting to the tent flap. "This is a sacred grove. We should not be here." The legate replied sternly, "We are here by the will of the emperor. The emperors will override spirits." But as he lay in his cot that night, listening to the drip, drip, drip of condensation from the trees, the legate wondered. The power of Rome felt very far away. The marble statues, the Senate, the cheering crowds, they were a dream. The reality was this wet, cold, watching darkness. Outside, the sentries stood on the ramparts, peering into the swirling white void. They clutched their spears, their breath misting in the cold air. They were the eyes of the legion, but they were blind. They were the ears of the legion, but all they could hear were the whispers in the wind. "Go back." The wind seemed to sigh through the pine needles. "Go back while you can." But the Ninth Legion did not go back. They were the machine that only moved forward. They were caught in the trap of their own discipline, marching deeper into the mouth of the mystery. The unease of the northern wilds had settled into their bones, a cold dread that no fire could warm. The enemy had not yet thrown a single spear, but the battle for the mind had already begun. And in the dark, silent depths of the Caledonian forest, the Ninth Legion was losing. The mist, which had been a ghostly companion for days, eventually gave way to something far more tangible and brutal. It began with a darkening of the upper atmosphere, a bruising of the sky that turned the canopy of the forest from a verdant twilight to a deep charcoal gloom. The wind died down, leaving a heavy, pressurized silence that pressed against the eardrums. And then, the heavens opened. This was not a sudden Italian thunderstorm, violent and brief. This was a Caledonian deluge. It began as a steady drumming rhythm on the leaves high above. Within the hour, the canopy could no longer hold the weight of the water, and it broke through. The rain fell in sheets. It was cold, relentless, and gray. It washed away the colors of the world, turning the greens of the forest and the reds of the Roman tunics into varying shades of slate and mud. For the Ninth Legion, the march transformed from a psychological haunting into a visceral physical torture. The road, if the muddy track they were following, could still be called a road disintegrated. The Romans were master road builders, but here, deep in the wild north, there was no stone foundation to save them. There was only the earth, a deep, rich soil that, when mixed with the relentless deluge, turned into a thick, clinging glue. The sound of the march changed. The muffled thud of footsteps was replaced by a wet, sucking squelch. Slap, suck, slap, suck. It was the sound of 5,000 pairs of hobnailed boots fighting for every inch of ground. The mud was not merely dirt. It was an adversary. It grabbed at the caligae, the soldier's sandals. With every step, a legionary lifted not just his leg, but pounds of earth attached to his feet. The muscles in their calves and thighs burned with a fire that never went out. To understand the scale of this misery, let's look at a single soldier. A man like Severus in the 4th cohort. He carried his marching pack, the sarcina. It held his rations, his cooking pot, his tools, and his spare clothing. In dry conditions, it weighed about 45 pounds, but now everything was waterlogged. The wool of his cloak had soaked up the rain like a sponge, doubling in weight. The leather of his tent was sodden and black with moisture. The rain beat a ceaseless rhythm on his helmet. Plink, plink, plink. It was a form of water torture, amplified inside the metal bowl, isolating him from his comrades. Water streamed down the metal rim, dripping onto his nose, running down his neck, and finding its way under his armor. The larica segmentata, the famous segmented plate armor of the Romans, was a marvel against swords and spears. Against the rain, it was a trap. The water seeped between the iron plates. It soaked the padded doublet worn underneath, which was meant to prevent chafing. Now, that wet padding rubbed raw against the skin. With every swing of the arm, wet wool and rusty iron ground against flesh. Red sores opened up on shoulders and hips, stinging with the salt of sweat and the grit of the mud. And then there was the rust. The insidious creeping orange cancer. Iron requires care. It demands oil and dryness. In the humidity of the Mediterranean, maintenance was a chore. In the deluge of Caledonia, it was a losing battle. The soldiers watched in despair as spots of rust bloomed on their cherished equipment within hours. The polished sheen, the pride of the parade ground, was vanishing under a layer of oxidation. They tried to oil their blades during brief halts, huddling under their cloaks to shield the metal from the rain, but the moisture was in the air itself. It was unavoidable. The baggage train, usually the lifeline of the legion, became its anchor. The heavy wooden wagons laden with grain and supplies became hopelessly mired. The wheels cut deep ruts into the soft earth, sinking to their axles. The legion, a symbol of relentless forward momentum, was slowly, grindingly, being swallowed by the land itself. The shouts of the muleteers were lost in the roar of the rain. Push! By Jupiter, push! Legionaries had to stack their spears and put their shoulders to the muddy wood of the wagons. They slipped and fell, their faces splashing into the muck. They rose, coated in brown slime, spitting grit, their eyes rimmed with red from exhaustion. The oxen, those great patient beasts, lowered their heads against the driving rain, their breath steaming, their hooves churning the path into a slurry. Sometimes, an animal would simply give up. It would sink to its knees, refusing to rise, its spirit broken by the mud. The soldiers would have to unload the wagon, carrying the heavy sacks of grain on their own backs, ferrying the supplies forward yard by agonizing yard. The horizon was gone. There was no distance anymore. There was only the gray curtain of rain in front of your face. The world had shrunk to the man in front of you. You watched his muddy heels lift and fall. You watched the water stream off the rim of his shield. You watched him stumble, and you reached out a hand to steady him, not out of affection, but out of the desperate need to keep the column moving. If the column stopped, you might never start again. Time became distorted. Did the sun rise? Did it set? It was impossible to tell. The sky remained a uniform, oppressive slate gray. It was a perpetual twilight that offered no hope of warmth. When the order finally came to halt for the night, there was no relief. Building a camp in this weather was a Herculean task. The ground was too wet to hold the stakes of the palisade firmly. The ditch filled with water as soon as it was dug, turning the defensive perimeter into a moat of sludge. And the fire. The fire was the greatest loss. Fire is the heart of a soldier's morale. It dries his clothes, cooks his food, and warms his spirit. But in the sodden forest, there was no dry wood. The fallen branches were soaked through. The men gathered twigs and stripped bark, trying to shield a spark with their bodies, striking flint against steel until their fingers were numb. Sparks would fly, hiss into the damp tinder, and die. Smoke would rise thick, acrid white smoke that stung the eyes, but no flame would catch. Again and again, they tried, until resignation set in. There would be no fires tonight. The soldiers sat in their tents, which leaked at the seams. They ate their rations cold hard tack that had turned to mush in the damp, and cold bacon fat. They huddled together for warmth, body against body, a pile of wet wool and shivering flesh. The smell inside the tents was overpowering, the stench of unwashed bodies, wet dog, mold, and fear. Sleep was not rest. It was merely a collapse. They slept in their armor for fear of a surprise attack, and because the metal, cold as it was, offered some barrier against the wet ground. They drifted into fitful dreams, haunted by the sound of the rain drumming on the leather canvas. Tap, dash, tap, dash, tap, like a clock counting down the seconds of their endurance. By the third day of the rain, the fatigue had settled deep into the marrow. It was a metabolic exhaustion. The body burns an immense amount of energy simply trying to stay warm in cold, wet conditions. The soldiers were shivering constantly, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that made it hard to hold a cup or buckle a strap. Their lips were blue. The skin on their hands was white and wrinkled, the washerwoman's hands that come from constant immersion. Coughs began to ripple through the ranks. It started as a few isolated hacks, but soon it was a chorus that rivaled the sound of the rain. The damp was settling in the lungs. Men marched with feverish eyes, their foreheads hot despite the cold rain. The centurions, those iron men of discipline, were not immune. A centurion named Maximus, a man who had led charges in Dacia and Germania, found himself struggling to keep his footing. His vine staff, the symbol of his office, was slippery in his grip. He looked at his men and saw the change. The crisp, sharp lines of the Ninth Legion were gone. They were no longer the shining soldiers of Rome. They were mudmen. They were golems of clay and iron, trudging mindlessly forward. Maximus saw a young soldier, barely 18, stop in the middle of the track. The boy simply stopped, his shield arm hanging limp, his head bowed. The mud was up to his shins. "Move, soldier," Maximus croaked, his voice a shadow of its former roar. The boy looked up. His eyes were hollow, rimmed with dark circles. "I can't, Centurion. The mud ... It's holding me." Maximus waded over, the muck sucking at his own boots. He grabbed the boy by the shoulder plate of his armor. "The mud is just earth. You are Ramon. You do not yield to dirt. Move." He shoved the boy forward. The boy stumbled, found his footing, and kept walking. It wasn't courage that drove them now. It was inertia. It was the fear that if they stopped, the earth would simply reclaim them, swallowing them up until only the tips of their spears remained above the bog. The landscape itself seemed to be hostile. The streams they had to cross had swollen into raging torrents. Brown water foamed over rocks, carrying tree trunks and debris. Crossing these rivers was a life-and-death struggle. The men had to link arms, forming a human chain to resist the current. If a man slipped, the weight of his armor would drag him down instantly. They lost men to the water. A slip, a splash, a brief struggle, and then the brown water smoothed over. There was no time to mourn. The column had to keep moving. The survival of the many depended on the ruthless abandonment of the fallen. As they crested a ridge on the fourth day of the rain, hoping for a break in the weather, they saw only more of the same. The gray horizon. Ahead of them lay a valley choked with mist and rain. The hills beyond were invisible, lost in the wash of gray. It looked infinite. It looked as though the whole world had drowned. This was the moment the doubt truly set in. Not the fear of the enemy. They hadn't seen a single tribesman in days, but the fear of the land. How could they conquer a place that was liquid? How could they build forts on ground that flowed like water? How could they bring order to a chaos of mud? The Legion was fighting a war against the elements, and the elements were winning. Their bowstrings, made of sinew, were slack and useless. Their shields, made of wood and leather, were heavy and waterlogged. The plywood layers began to delaminate. Their sandals were falling apart, the leather rotting from the constant wet. They were being stripped of their technological advantages. Without their mobility, without their firepower, without their organization, they were just cold, wet men wandering in the wilderness. And yet, they marched, one foot in front of the other. The discipline instilled in them since recruitment held the line together, even as the individual parts began to fray. They marched because there was no going back. The road behind them was washed out, a river of mud. The only way was forward, into the gray, into the rain that felt like it would never end. The mist and the rain had done what the enemy could not. It had humbled the Ninth. It had stripped away the golden veneer of the Empire and left them naked to the cold reality of the North. They were no longer marching for glory. They were marching for a patch of dry ground. They were marching to escape the endless, crushing weight of the gray horizon. And all the while, hidden in the storm, the eyes of the North continued to watch, patient and dry in their caves and hidden glens, waiting for the rain to finish its work before they began theirs. The Legion was tired. The Legion was rusting. And the trap was slowly, inexorably closing. The rain, which had been a relentless hammer against the anvil of the earth for days, finally ceased. It didn't end with a dramatic clearing of the sky or a burst of sunlight. It simply faded, retreating into a damp, hanging mist that clung to the treetops like spun wool. The world was left dripping. Every leaf, every branch, every blade of grass held a bead of water, and the forest was filled with the soft, rhythmic plip-plip-plip of moisture falling to the sodden ground. But with the end of the rain came a new quality to the light. It was the time of the gloaming, that suspended moment between day and night, where the world loses its sharp edges and dissolves in the shades of indigo and charcoal. In the deep valleys of Caledonia, the gloaming seemed to last for hours. The sun was hidden behind the high ridges, casting the Legion into a premature twilight. It was a light that played tricks on the eyes, making distance impossible to judge and turning gnarled tree roots into crouching figures. The Ninth Legion marched on, but the rhythm had changed. The heavy, sucking sound of the mud was now accompanied by a sharp, brittle tension. The men were no longer just fighting the ground. They were scanning the trees. The trouble began not with a roar of battle, but with an absence. The explorators, the Legion scouts, were the eyes of the army. These were men chosen for their speed and their sharp senses, sent ahead on light horses to map the path and spot ambush. Usually, they would ride out and return within the hour, reporting on river crossings or clearings. But on this afternoon, 3 scouts had ridden into the mist ahead of the vanguard, and 2 hours had passed without their return. The column did not stop her. Roman Legion is a beast that is difficult to halt, but the silence at the front of the line grew heavy. The centurions exchanged glances. They checked the sun, or where they guessed the sun to be. They should have been back. Then, a horse appeared. It trotted out of the fog, coming down the track toward the main column. It was a scout's horse, its coat slick with sweat and condensation. The animal was calm, almost eerily so. It didn't gallop in panic. It simply walked back to the herd. The reins trailed in the mud. The saddle was empty. The vanguard halted. A hush rippled down the line. A soldier stepped forward and caught the horse's bridle. He ran a hand over the saddle leather. It was warm. He checked the flanks. There was no blood. There were no scratches. The horse had not been in a battle. Its rider had simply vanished. Where is he? A young recruit whispered, his voice cracking. Quiet, the Decurion hissed, scanning the tree line. Eyes open. The empty saddle was a message. It was a statement of control. The enemy was saying, "We can take your eyes whenever we choose." As the Legion pushed forward, passing the point where the horse had emerged, they found the first of the symbols. The forest here was dominated by ancient oaks, their trunks as wide as watchtowers. On the bark of these trees, fresh scars gleamed white against the dark moss. The soldiers slowed as they passed them. These were not random markings. They were deliberate. Intricate spirals had been carved into the wood, loops that turned in on themselves without beginning or end. There were crude depictions of stags with antlers that looked like flames. There were knots that hurt the eyes to look at, patterns that seemed to ride in the dim light. A veteran named Galen reached out and touched one of the carvings. His finger came away sticky with sap. Fresh, he murmured to the man beside him. They were here, minutes ago. The realization hit the ranks like a physical blow. The enemy was not miles away in a stronghold. The enemy was here. They were just beyond the veil of the mist, perhaps only 10 paces into the dense undergrowth, watching the Romans marvel at their handiwork. The paranoia began to rise like bile in the throat. Every soldier felt the skin on the back of his neck prickle. They gripped their scutum shields tighter, their knuckles white. They stopped looking at the path ahead and started looking sideways into the deep, shadowy recesses of the wood. Was that a movement in the ferns? Was that the snap of a twig? Or just the settling of the baggage wagons? The first skirmish, when it finally came, was so brief and silent that half the legion didn't even know it had happened until it was over. It occurred at the rear guard, the place where the column was most vulnerable, dragging its tail through the mud. A group of soldiers was struggling with a cart that had thrown a wheel. They were knee-deep in muck, cursing the axle, their shields stacked against a nearby tree. There was no war cry, no blowing of horns, just a sudden, sharp thwack, thwack, whack. 3 men crumpled. It happened so fast that the others stared for a second, uncomprehending. Then they saw the darts. Small, vicious projectiles, fletched with crow feathers, had buried themselves in the unprotected necks and thighs of their comrades. Ambush! Shields up! The Optio screamed. The soldiers scrambled for their weapons, forming a defensive circle, their gladi drawn and ready to thrust. They faced the forest, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They waited for the charge. They waited for the screaming barbarians to burst from the cover, but nothing happened. There was only the forest. The fern fronds swayed gently, though there was no wind. A branch shook high above, dropping a shower of water droplets. The enemy had struck and evaporated. Where are they? A soldier yelled, spinning around. Show yourselves, cowards! His voice was swallowed by the moss. The silence that followed was more terrifying than a battle. A battle they could understand. A battle had rules. This was not a battle. It was a hunt. And they were the prey. They loaded the wounded onto the remaining wagons. The men groaned, clutching their wounds. The darts were removed, but the tips were dark, stained with something that wasn't rust. Poison. Within the hour, the wounded men were seized with violent tremors, their skin turning a pale, clammy gray. They died foaming at the mouth, their eyes wide with a terror that seemed to see something beyond the physical world. News of the poison spread through the ranks like wildfire. They don't fight with honor, the men whispered. They fight with the forest venom. That night, the camp was a place of high anxiety. The usual efficiency of a Roman encampment was gone, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. The ditch was dug deeper. The stakes were set closer together. Extra sentries were posted, 2 for every one that was standard. But the darkness of the Caledonian night was absolute. The clouds blocked the stars, and the moon was a distant memory. The only light came from the watchfires, which cast long, dancing shadows against the wall of trees surrounding them. It was in this flickering light that the paranoia truly took hold. In the 3rd cohort, a fight broke out. It started over a spilled cup of wine, but it escalated instantly into a brawl. 2 men, friends who had served together for years, were rolling in the mud, punching each other with savage intensity. "He looked at me!" one shouted as the centurion pulled him off. "I saw his eyes. He's one of them. He's a shapeshifter." The soldier was delirious, his eyes wild. The stress, the lack of sleep, the constant fear of the unseen had snapped something in his mind. He didn't see his comrade anymore. He saw a monster. The centurion slapped him hard across the face. "Get a hold of yourself, legionary. We are Romans. We do not break." But the centurion's voice lacked conviction. He too had felt it. He, too, had seen things in the corner of his eye that shouldn't be there. Later that night, a sentry on the north wall blew his whistle. The camp erupted into action. Men poured out of tents, swords in hand, rushing to the ramparts. "What is it? What did you see?" The sentry was shaking, pointing out into the black void beyond the torchlight. There, in the trees, lights. The officers peered into the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Then they saw it. Faint blue lights, bobbing and weaving between the tree trunks. They were like corpse candles or will-o'-the-wisps. They moved in patterns, swirling and dancing. "Are they torches?" a tribune asked. "No fire burns blue like that," a veteran replied quietly. "That is cold fire." The lights didn't advance. They didn't retreat. They just hovered there, just out of javelin range, taunting the Romans. It was a reminder, we are awake while you sleep. We are watching you. Some of the men began to mutter prayers to gods they hadn't thought of in years. They prayed to Mercury for safe travel, to Mars for strength, but mostly they prayed to the local spirits, begging for forgiveness for trespassing. The strict Roman discipline, which relied on logic and order, was eroding against the irrational terror of the woods. The next morning, the shadows and the glowmen delivered their final message. As the column prepared to move out, a patrol checking the perimeter found the missing scouts. They were not far from the camp, perhaps only 100 yards, hidden in a small clearing that the mist had obscured the day before. They had not been simply killed. They had been arranged. The 3 bodies were tied to the trunks of 3 separate trees, facing the path the Legion would have to take. Their armor had been stripped away, leaving them in their tunics. Their eyes were open, staring blankly at the road. But it was what was in their mouths that made the soldiers retch. Their mouths were stuffed with soil and pine needles. It was a brutal, symbolic gesture. "You want our land? Here, taste it. Eat it. Choke on it." The legate rode up to the scene. He looked at his dead men, his face a mask of stone. He knew what this was. This was designed to break them before the main battle even began. If the soldiers believed they were fighting demons, they would lose. "Cut them down," he ordered, his voice flat. "Burn the bodies." We march in the hour. But as the men worked to cut the ropes, their hands trembling, they couldn't shake the feeling that the trees themselves were holding on to the bodies. The forest felt alive, a single hostile organism that was digesting them slowly. The march resumed, but the Legion that left that clearing was not the same one that had entered the forest days ago. They were quieter now. Their heads were lowered. They no longer walked with the arrogant stride of conquerors. They walked like men crossing a graveyard at midnight. The gloaming had settled into their souls. The shadows had lengthened, stretching from the trees into the very hearts of the men. They knew now that they were not just fighting a tribe of barbarians. They were fighting the mist, the dark, and the ancient, brooding spirit of the North. And the trouble, the real trouble, was only just beginning. The valley had no name on any Roman map. To the surveyors who had hastily sketched the route days before, it was merely a depression in the topography, a shallow bowl nestled between 2 brooding granite ridges. But to the men of the Ninth Legion who marched into it as the sun began to fail, it felt like a throat. The slopes rose steeply on either side, covered in dark, tangled scree and ancient pines that leaned inward, as if conspiring to block out the sky. It was the 7th day of the march, or perhaps the 8th. In the gray monotony of the north, time had lost its rigid structure. The commanders had chosen this spot for the night as encampment because it offered shelter from the biting wind. It was a tactical decision based on logic. High walls protect from the gale. But in Caledonia, logic was a trap. The wind did not blow here. It is true. Instead, the air sat stagnant and heavy, pooling in the bottom of the valley like water in a cup. As the order to halt echoed down the weary line, the men set about their tasks with mechanical exhaustion. They were ghosts of their former selves. Their armor was dull and streaked with rust. Their tunics were sodden and mud-stained. They moved slowly, their limbs weighted by the damp cold that had seeped into their very marrow. The construction of the camp was sloppy. The ditch was shallow, The rampart was low. The stakes were driven into the soft, mossy earth with a lack of conviction. The men were too tired to care. They just wanted to sleep. They wanted to close their eyes and pretend they were back in Ebracum, safe behind stone walls. But the defining feature of this night was not the fatigue, nor the terrain. It was the mist. It began as the twilight deepened into true night. It did not roll in from the sea. It seemed to sweat out of the ground itself. It rose from the moss, from the black soil, from the needles of the pines. It was thicker than any fog they had encountered before. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of white that swallowed the world. By the time the watches were set, visibility was reduced to the length of a spear. A man standing at the entrance of his tent could not see the tent of his neighbor 10 feet away. The camp, usually a grid of order and light, was fragmented into thousands of isolated islands. And then the fires began to die. The forest was a trap. The wood the soldiers of the Ninth Legion gathered was utterly saturated with water, refusing to burn. Desperate for warmth, for light, they used their precious oil reserves to coax sputtering flames to life. For a fleeting hour, the camp was a constellation of hissing orange glows against the encroaching night. But the valley had other plans. As the hours dragged on, the air grew thick with a chilling, heavy moisture that seemed to possess a will of its own, actively choking the life from their fires. One by one, they popped, hissed, and vanished, leaving behind only the acrid smell of wet charcoal and an unnerving, deepening darkness. "Keep the fires lit!" Centurions shouted, their voices strangely muffled by the suffocating fog. "More oil! Don't let them go out!" But their commands were futile. The oil was low, and the wood was a sponge. It felt as if the valley itself was extinguishing them, sucking the heat and light from the world. By midnight, the Ninth Legion was plunged into an obsidian blackness. It wasn't just dark. It was a physical presence, a weight against the eyes. The only light came from a few dying torches at the command tent and the gate, glowing like faint embers in a vast ocean of black milk. In this sudden blindness, the soldiers' other senses went into overdrive. Deprived of sight, they began to listen. Really listen. They heard the rhythmic drip of water from their tent flaps. They heard the shallow, anxious breathing of the man next to them. They heard the restless stamping and whinnying of the horses in the picket lines. And then they heard it. The sound that would forever haunt the nightmares of the few who survived. It started low, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath their feet. It climbed in pitch, becoming a mournful, wailing scream that tore through the mist, a sound designed to terrify. It was the Carnix, the great bronze war horn of the Celtic tribes. It sounded like a colossal beast dying, or a demon screaming its arrival. It wasn't a signal for maneuvers. It was a weapon of psychological warfare, engineered to liquefy the bowels of the enemy. The unearthly wail came from the ridge to their left, then an answer from the ridge to their right, then from the trees directly ahead, and then, impossibly, from behind them. They were surrounded. "Stand to!" The cry rippled through the camp. "Form ranks!" "Alarm! Alarm!" Chaos erupted. Men stumbled out of their tents, blindly groping in the dark for their shields and swords, colliding with each other in a panic. Officers shouted orders that were swallowed by the fog before they could travel more than a few feet. "First cohort, to the gate! Rear guard, hold the line! Where is the enemy? Where are they coming from?" There was no answer. There was no direction. This wasn't a wave of attackers. It was a seepage. The enemy was already among them. The tribesmen had used the cover of the unnatural dark and the sound-dampening mist to creep right up to the edge of the camp's ditch. They had slipped over the shallow ramparts like shadows, not with war cries, but in utter silence. The first sign that the perimeter was breached wasn't a watchman's challenge. It was the gurgling, wet cry of sentries dying before they could even draw their weapons. And then panic, the truest enemy of any Roman legion, took hold. A legion is a machine. It relies on formation, on discipline. Shield locks with shield. Man supports man. But you cannot form a shield wall if you cannot see your comrade. You cannot follow a standard if the eagle itself is lost in the fog. The machine broke. In an instant, it shattered into 5,000 terrified individuals fighting for their lives in a box of complete darkness. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and utterly confused. A soldier would see a shape loom out of the mist, a shadow with an arm raised to strike. He would thrust his gladius, feel it bite into flesh, only to hear a Latin curse as his fellow legionary fell beside him. Cries of, "Blue on blue, hold your fire, identify," were lost in the pandemonium. But the Picts were there too, moving with a ghostly fluidity the heavily armored Romans couldn't hope to match. They were phantoms striking at the legs, the unarmored thighs, hamstring the heavy infantry. They used cruel hook blades to wrench shields down, exposing the men behind them. They smashed any lanterns the officers desperately tried to light, plunging the few pockets of organized resistance back into the suffocating dark. At the center of the camp, near the Praetorium, the legate himself tried to organize a defense. He stood by the standard bearer, the golden eagle gleaming faintly in the light of the last sputtering brazier. "Rally to the eagle! Rally to me!" He roared, drawing his sword. A few soldiers, their eyes wide with terror, stumbled toward the sound of his voice. They managed to form a small circle, a testudo born of desperation. But the mist was swirling violently now, agitated by the heat of bodies and the frantic movement of battle. It created a disorienting strobe effect, where figures appeared and disappeared in milliseconds. And from the darkness above, a new terror rained down. Sling stones, whirring like angry hornets, cracked against helmets and smashed into faces. Javelins, thrown from the unseen ridges, flew silently from the invisible sky, piercing the leather tents and the men cowering inside them. Then the horses panicked. The picket lines broke. Hundreds of terrified 1,000-pound animals stampeded through the camp, thundering through the tent lines, trampling friend and foe alike, adding a layer of chaotic thunder to the symphony of screams. The ground, already soft, was churned into a thick slurry of mud and blood. This wasn't a siege of walls, but a siege of the mind. Communication was completely severed. The Cornicans, the Roman horn blowers, tried to sound the signals for formation, but the unearthly wailing of the Pictish war horns drowned them out. The Roman trumpet blast sounded tinny and weak, lost in the acoustic soup of the valley. A centurion of the second cohort found himself fighting back-to-back with a stranger. They swung their swords wildly at the shifting shapes in the fog. "Who are you?" The centurion gasped, his lungs burning. "Lucius, fourth cohort," the man replied, his voice shaking. "Where is your unit, Lucius?" "Gone," he choked out. "They're all gone. Gemist." The mist took them. The mist itself seemed to be the primary weapon. It separated men with terrifying efficiency. A soldier would step forward to strike at an enemy and suddenly find himself alone, the sounds of battle muffled, completely disoriented. You would turn to find his unit, but the camp had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of white. Then a spear would lunge from the nothingness, and he would fall, his death unseen and unheard by his comrades just feet away. The climax of the night came when the central brazier, the last beacon of light in the entire valley, was overturned. A group of tribesmen, screaming now that stealth was no longer needed, charged the command circle. The large vessel of oil tipped over. For one brilliant, terrible second, the fire flared up, illuminating a horrific tableau of twisted, painted faces, raised axes, and falling Romans. And then it was stomped out. The darkness became absolute, total. This was the moment the Ninth Legion truly died. Not when the last man fell, but when the last light failed. In that pitch black, the structure of the army dissolved. There were no more officers, no more rank, no more Rome. There was only the primal animal instinct to survive in a world that had gone completely blind. The soldiers of the Ninth Legion threw down their shields. They abandoned the heavy packs that weighed them down. And they ran. They ran blindly into the dark, tripping over guy ropes, falling into ditches, scrambling up the scree-covered slopes of the valley. But the valley was a bowl, and its rim was lined with the enemy. The slaughter that followed was not a battle. It was a harvest. The sounds of the night changed from the clash of steel to the moans of the wounded and the heavy, wet thuds of execution. And yet, through it all, the mist remained impassive. It absorbed the violence. It muffled the screams so that they sounded distant, dreamlike. As the pre-dawn hours approached, a strange silence began to settle over the valley. The Karnak's horn stopped blowing. The shouting died down. The stampede of horses faded into the distance. The fires were out. The heat was gone. The camp of the Ninth Legion, which had been a bustling city of leather and iron just hours before, was now a graveyard shrouded in white. In the darkness, a young soldier lay beneath a collapsed wagon, shivering not from the cold, but from shock. He held his breath, listening. He heard the soft squelch of footsteps in the mud passing nearby. He heard a language he didn't understand, guttural, sharp, triumphant. He squeezed his eyes shut. He knew with a terrifying certainty that he was alone. The might of Rome, the invincible machine that had conquered the known world, had been dismantled in a single night of shadow and fog. The fires had gone out, and they would never be lit again. The mist had claimed them. As the first hint of dawn tried to bleed into the valley, it did not bring light. Instead, it turned the pitch-black darkness into a suffocating milk-white opacity. The fog, which had been a shroud during the night, transformed into a wall. It was a dawn without a sun, a morning without a horizon. For the Ninth Legion, the rising of the day brought no relief from the terror of the night. It only served to illuminate the scale of their isolation. A battle, in the classical Roman sense, is a thing of geometry and order. It is lines of infantry moving in sync to the whistle of the centurion. It is the locked wall of shields, the testudo, creating an impenetrable shell. It is a contest of discipline against fury. But in this nameless Caledonian valley, there was no geometry. There were no lines. The concept of front and rear had ceased to exist. There was only the white void and the death that lived inside it. The confusion was total. A legionary, waking from the days of the initial attack, would stand up and see nothing but swirling mist. He extended his arm, and his hand disappeared into the vapor. The world had shrunk to a radius of perhaps 3 feet the length of a sword arm. Beyond that circle lay the unknown. The sound of the battle was distorted by the damp air. The clash of iron on iron, usually a sharp, ringing sound, was dull and flat, like a hammer striking wet wood. Screams did not carry. They were swallowed instantly, sounding distant and dreamlike even when the dying man was only yards away. This acoustic distortion created a terrifying sense of loneliness. Every soldier felt as though he were the last man left alive, fighting a solitary war against a phantom army. The Roman discipline, drilled into them on the sunny fields of Eboracum, began to fracture. The training said, "Look to the standard. Follow the eagle." But where was the eagle? Where were the standards? In the whiteout, the tall poles with their golden icons were invisible. Without a visual anchor, the cohorts drifted apart. Like a ship losing its rudder in a storm, the legion spun aimlessly. Small knots of resistance formed purely by accident. 5 or 6 men would bump into each other in the fog, back to back, their shields raised. They did not know if they were first cohort or auxiliaries. They only knew they were Romans, and they were terrified. "Hold!" A voice would cry out from the mist. "Form on me! By Jupiter, form on me!" But the voice was disembodied. Soldiers hesitating to run toward the sound found themselves paralyzed by indecision. Was it their centurion, or was it a trap? The tribesmen had learned to mimic the Roman shouts, luring men into the deeper pockets of the mist only to silence them forever. The enemy remained largely unseen. This was the most harrowing aspect of the battle. Instead, they flowed like water. A Roman soldier would tense, shield raised, staring into the whiteness. He would thrust his gladius, stabbing at the air. Nothing. Then, from the side, a spear would lunge out of the vapor. It would strike with devastating precision, finding the gap between the helmet and the breastplate. The Roman would fall, and the shadow would vanish again. It was like fighting smoke. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. They were the mist itself, given form and malice. The ground, churned into a slurry by the rain and the stampeding horses, became a treacherous enemy. Men slipped and fell in the mud, their heavy armor dragging them down. To fall was to die. Friendly fire, the ultimate tragedy of warfare, became rampant. In the chaos, panic replaced recognition. A figure would loom out of the fog, sword raised. A terrified legionary, adrenaline flooding his veins, would strike first, driving his blade into the chest of the intruder. Only as the man fell, his helmet rolling away in the mud, would the killer recognize the face of his tent mate. "Forgive me," he would whisper to the wet earth. I didn't see, but there was no time for grief. The fog swirled again, and the killer became the victim. In the center of the valley, where the command tent had once stood, a brutal, claustrophobic struggle was taking place. The legate and his personal guard were fighting for the eagle. The golden bird, the soul of the ninth, was bobbing frantically above the heads of the men, a beacon that no one could see. They were a tiny island of discipline in an ocean of chaos. But the tide was rising. The ghostly figures of the tribesmen closed in, their numbers seemingly endless. Spears thrust from the fog, answered by the desperate swings of Roman swords. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the suffocating dampness of the mist. One by one, the guards fell. The centurion protecting the legate took a spear in the throat, his final order gurgling into silence. The legate himself, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, fought with the fury of a cornered lion, but he was just one man against a tide of shadows. His sword broke. His shield was shattered. He fell, and the white mist covered him like a burial shroud. For a moment, the golden eagle of the Ninth Legion teetered on its standard. The last man holding it, a young aquilifer, clutched the pole with bleeding hands. His eyes, wide with terror, scanned the impenetrable wall of white. The eagle, the symbol of Roman power, the very soul of the legion, fell. It disappeared into the mud, its golden wings tarnished by the bloody earth of this cursed valley. With its fall, the heart of the Ninth Legion stopped beating. The remaining pockets of resistance dissolved into individual flights of terror. The organized battle was over. The massacre was nearly complete. As the sun, still invisible, rose higher, the fog began to thin. But it didn't dissipate entirely. It clung to the low ground, a wispy blanket over the dead. The scale of the devastation was revealed in haunting glimpses. A field of bodies, contorted in their final moments of agony. A pile of shields, discarded like turtle shells. A lone horse, wandering aimlessly, its saddle empty. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water from the trees and the distant call of a crow. The Ninth Legion was gone, vanished, swallowed by the mists of Caledonia. History would record their disappearance as a mystery, a legion that simply marched off the map. But for those who died here, there was no mystery. There was only the white darkness, the unseen enemy, and the cold, wet embrace of death in a foreign land. They came as conquerors, as the unstoppable force of an empire. But they learned that even the greatest empires can be broken, not by armies, but by the land itself. They learned that in the mist, all men are blind, and all empires are fragile. The legend of the Lost Legion was born not in a heroic last stand, but in a chaotic, terrifying slaughter where men couldn't even see the hand that killed them. They were not defeated in battle. They were erased by the fog. The legate, his ornate armor battered and muddy, swung his sword with the desperation of a man who knows the end has written itself. He wasn't fighting to win anymore. He was fighting for dignity. He screamed orders that no one could execute. Close ranks, shield wall. But how do you form a wall when you cannot see the man next to you? The gaps in the line were exploited instantly. The tribesmen poured through the holes in the formation, stabbing from behind, cutting the hamstrings, pulling men down. The wall was porous, a sieve trying to hold back the ocean. The visual landscape of the battle was a series of terrifying vignettes. A soldier would see a horse gallop past, riderless, its eyes rolling white with madness. He would see a spear fly out of the nothingness and pin a man to a tree. You would see the flash of a blue-painted face, a mouth open in a silent scream of rage, before the fog swallowed it again. It was a battle of ghosts. The Romans were fighting shadows, and the shadows were winning. The psychological breakdown was absolute. The legion was not defeated by superior weaponry or superior numbers. It was defeated by the environment. The fog stripped them of their greatest asset, their cohesion. It turned a single mighty organism into 5,000 frightened individuals. Some men simply broke. They threw down their shields, the ultimate disgrace, and ran. They ran blindly into the mist, seeking the slopes of the valley, seeking escape. But the valley was a bowl, and the mist was a cage. Those who ran found themselves isolated, picked off one by the hunters waiting in the perimeter. Their screams, cut short, drifted back to the main melee, further destroying the morale of those who stood and fought. As the morning wore on, the intensity of the fighting began to change. The frantic energy of the initial ambush gave way to a sluggish, grinding slaughter. The Romans were exhausted. Their arms were heavy as lead. They could barely lift their shields. They stood in the mud, panting, waiting for the blow that would end it. The mist seemed to thicken, if that were possible. It filled the lungs with moisture, drowning the men on dry land. It tasted of copper, the metallic tang of blood, mixing with the peat of the earth. A young Optio, a second in command, found himself standing alone in a small clearing in the mist. He spun around, sword ready. He was surrounded by the sounds of slaughter, the wet thuds, the groans, the clashing of steel, but he could see nothing. He felt an overwhelming sense of unreality. Was this happening? Or was it a nightmare induced by the fever of the march? He saw a shape emerge. It was a centurion, identifiable by the transverse crest on his helmet. The man was stumbling, dragging a leg. "Sir?" the Optio called out. The centurion looked up. His face was a mask of blood. He looked at the Optio with eyes that saw nothing. "The mist," the centurion whispered. "It has teeth." Then he collapsed face first into the mud. The Optio backed away, and the mist closed over the body. He was alone again. This was the nature of the battle in the fog. It was a series of personal, lonely tragedies. There was no grand charge, no heroic last stand on a hilltop. There was just a slow, systematic dismantling of the legion, piece by piece, man by man, in the quiet, suffocating embrace of the cloud. The breakdown of discipline was not a choice. It was an inevitability. You cannot command what you cannot see. You cannot obey what you cannot hear. The chain of command, the iron skeleton of the Roman army, had rusted away in a single night. Eventually, the noise began to subside. The clashing of steel became sporadic. The screams became fewer. The heavy, rhythmic panting of the survivors was louder than the battle itself. The enemy, sensing the end, pulled back. They did not need to finish every single man in hand-to-hand combat. They knew the valley. They knew the cold. They knew that the wounded would not survive the day. They faded back into the trees, becoming part of the forest once more. The Romans who remained standing were left swinging at empty air. They stood in the white void, turning in circles, waiting for an attack that didn't come. They were the remnants of a shattered vessel. The fog held the valley in a tight grip. It hid the carnage. It softened the horror. If one were to look down from the ridges above, one would see nothing but a sea of white cloud, peaceful and still. But beneath that surface lay the ruin of the Ninth Legion. The battle had ended not with a cheer of victory, but with a dissolution. The discipline was gone. The order was gone. The pride of the empire lay broken in the mud, hidden from the eyes of history by the impenetrable, eternal mist of the north. The chaos had settled into a grim, silent reality. The Ninth was no more. They were just shadows now, lost in the gloaming, waiting for the final darkness to take them. The sun did not burst over the horizon in a blaze of glory. In Caledonia, the dawn is rarely a triumphant event. Instead, it was a slow, reluctant gray light that seeped into the valley, diluting the darkness of the night until the shapes of the world began to re-emerge from the void. The heavy blanket of mist that had choked the valley during the hours of darkness began to lift, but only slightly. It hovered a few feet above the ground, a spectral ocean that refused to reveal what lay beneath. For centuries, the mornings of the Ninth Legion had begun with a sound. It was a sound that defined the rhythm of their lives, the sharp, brassy call of the cornu and the tuba. That blast would cut through the air, signaling the start of the watch, the rousing of the men, the beginning of the Empire's day. It was followed by the shout of centurions, the clatter of pots, the stamping of hooves, and the low roar of 5,000 men waking up. But on this morning, there were no trumpets. The silence that lay over the valley was not merely the absence of noise. It was a physical wake. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to ring in the ears. It was the silence of a library after the books have been burned, or a cathedral after the prayers have ended. It was the silence of cessation. As the light strengthened, turning the mist from charcoal to a pale, ghostly pearl, the scene in the valley slowly revealed itself. It was a landscape of devastation, frozen in time. The camp, which had been a hive of ordered activity, was now a ruin. The tents, once arranged in precise rows, were flattened, trampled into the mud like discarded rinds. The wagons, the lifelines of the Legion, sat at odd angles. Some were overturned, their wheels spinning idly in the breeze. Others were sunk deep into the mire, their contents, grain, arrows, leather spilled out onto the wet earth. There was no movement. The chaotic swirl of the battle had evaporated with the night. The tribesmen, the ghosts of the forest, had vanished as silently as they had arrived. They had melted back into the tree line, taking their dead and their secrets with them. They left behind only the wreckage of Rome. The ground was a tapestry of destruction. The mud, churned up by thousands of feet and hooves, had begun to settle. In the hollows of the hoofprints, water pooled, reflecting the gray sky above. It looked like a field of small, dark mirrors. Scattered across this mud were the remnants of the Ninth. It was a graveyard of iron. Roman shields, the curved, red scutulae everywhere. Some were splintered, their wood shattered by axes. Others were whole, lying face down in the dirt like turtles hiding from the world. Spears were stuck into the ground at random angles, like a strange leafless forest that had sprung up overnight. And there were the helmets, the Gallia. They lay scattered among the debris, their cheek guards open, their iron bowls filled with rainwater. They looked like empty skulls, staring blindly up at the indifferent clouds. The plumes of horsehair red and white were matted with mud, stripped of their vibrant color. The lack of human voices was the most haunting element. There were no groans of the wounded. The cold of the Caledonian night had been mercifully efficient. Those who had not died by the sword had succumbed to the exposure. Now, they were simply shapes under the mist, mounds of red wool and iron that had become part of the terrain. Nature, indifferent to the tragedies of men, began to reclaim the space immediately. A crow, black as a piece of the night left behind, landed on the rim of an overturned wagon. It cocked its head, its bead-like eyes surveying the scene. It gave a single harsh croak that echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. It was the only judgment passed on the devastation. A gentle breeze began to stir, moving through the valley floor. It caught the flap of a torn tent, making it snap softly. It was a lonely rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat that was slowly fading away. In the center of the camp, near where the Praetorium had stood, the devastation was most complete. The ashes of the command fire were cold and sodden, a black scar on the earth. The legate's chair, a symbol of authority carved from oak, lay on its side, one leg broken. Maps, the precious papyrus scrolls that claimed to define the world, lay unraveled in the mud. The ink was running, the lines of forts and roads dissolving into meaningless blurs. The geography of the empire was being erased by the rain. The eagle, the Aquila, was nowhere to be seen. The golden bird, the very soul of the Legion, had flown. Had the tribes carried it off as a trophy? Or did it lie buried beneath a pile of bodies, lost in the mud? Its absence was a gaping wound. Without the eagle, this was no longer a military site. It was a slaughterhouse. The sun finally rose over the ridge, but it offered no warmth. It was a pale winter sun, casting long, weak shadows across the field. The light caught the edges of discarded weapons, a glint of silver on a sword, a sparkle of bronze on a buckle. These small flashes were the only movement in the valley. Then a red stag, its antlers like the branches of an ancient oak, stepped tentatively from the forest. It paused, sniffing the air. The scent of blood and iron was strong, but the danger was gone. It walked slowly into the ruined camp, stepping over a fallen spear, and lowered its head to graze. The wild majesty of the stag against the cold, dead machinery of empire. It was a sign that the land had already won. The iron would rust, the grass would endure. For anyone standing on that ridge, the scene would have brought a profound sense of melancholy. It wasn't just the loss of life, it was the loss of purpose. All the drilling, the polishing, the marching, all the years of discipline, it had all ended here, in a muddy valley at the edge of the known world. Rome's grand ambition to tame the wild had been swallowed by the silence. This dawn without trumpets was a dawn of realization, the moment history held its breath. The Ninth Legion Hispana had not just been defeated, it had been deleted. As the morning wore on, the silence deepened. No scavengers had arrived yet. The wolves would come later. For now, there was a respectful pause. The mist slowly evaporated, revealing the full extent of the emptiness. The road north, the road they had marched on with such confidence, was empty. The road south, back to safety, was empty. It felt as if the spirits of 5,000 men were still lingering in the mist, confused, waiting for an order that would never come, waiting for the trumpet to blow, waiting for the centurion to shout, "Form ranks!" But the air remained still. The trumpet lay in the mud, its brass dented, its voice choked with earth. The river that ran through the valley, red with the runoff of battle during the night, began to run clear again. The water scrubbed at the stones, washing away the evidence of violence, carrying it downstream to the sea. The water did not care. It flowed as it had for 1,000 years, and as it would for 1,000 more. In the distance, the wind sighed through the pine trees like a long exhalation. The forest was breathing out, expelling the foreign body that had tried to pierce its heart. There was no glory in this morning. No songs were being sung. There was only the haunting reality of absence. Avoid where a legion used to be. The ninth had walked into the mist, and the mist had simply closed behind them, leaving no trace but the silence. This dawn marked the transition from reality to legend. The men in the mud were no longer soldiers. They were the seeds of a mystery. They were the ghosts of the north. And as the sun climbed higher, casting its cold light over the empty helmets and the silent field, the tragedy felt complete. The trumpets would never sound for them again. The long sleep of the Ninth Legion had begun. South of the mist, the world was still made of stone and order. At the fortress of Eboracum and along the chain of forts dotting the northern frontier, life continued with the rigid mechanical precision of the Roman military. Water clocks dripped the hours away. Guard changes occurred at the blast of a trumpet. Blacksmiths repaired plows instead of swords. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, there was a hollow silence. It lived in the empty bunks of the barracks, in the quiet stalls of the stables, and in the eyes of the women in the settlements outside the walls. They were waiting. When the Ninth Legion had marched out, the mood had been one of grim determination, even confidence. They were the Hispana, veterans of a dozen wars. The expectation was a summer campaign. They would march north, burn a few villages, build a few forts, and return before the autumn rains turned the roads to soup. But autumn had come, and the roads had turned to soup, and the horizon remained empty. The anticipation began as a dull ache, a subtle tension. In the headquarters, clerks managed the logistics of an army that was no longer there. They tallied supplies sent north by train wagons that swallowed grain and wine and disappeared into the green void, never to return. The roads are bad, the commanders told each other. The distance is great. The couriers are delayed by the mud. It was a reasonable explanation. Communication in the ancient world was fragile. A washed-out bridge or a lame horse could delay news by weeks. So they waited. They scanned the northern horizon from the watchtowers, looking for the telltale dust cloud of a dispatch rider. But the dust never rose. The rain kept the earth damp and dark. As weeks dragged into months, the delay shifted from an annoyance to a source of deep, gnawing anxiety. Official reports from the north ceased completely. The supply wagons, meant to ferry food to the advancing column, began to falter. The drivers returned with empty carts and shaken expressions. "We couldn't find them," a supply master reported to the garrison commander, his cloak dripping on the mosaic floor. "We went to the rendezvous point at the river. We waited 3 days. No one came. The forest. It was too quiet. This was the first crack in the facade. A Roman legion does not miss a rendezvous. A legion is a creature of schedules. If they were not there, it meant they could not be there. Then came the rumors. They didn't arrive on sealed scrolls stamped with the legate's ring. They came like smoke, drifting down from the hill country, carried by traders and by the wind itself. In the marketplace, where soldiers' wives bought turnips and salted fish, the whispers were terrified and hushed. A fur trapper spoke of a great darkness in the north, of a valley where the birds refused to fly. He spoke of a river that had run red with blood for 2 days and nights. The spirits took them, the locals whispered. The land opened its mouth and swallowed the iron men. The Roman officers tried to suppress these stories. They called them superstition, the idle chatter of barbarians. The Ninth is a fighting force of 5,000 men, they declared in the public squares. They are not defeated by spirits. They are likely building a great fortress, too busy to write letters. But the bluster rang hollow. The officers knew. They knew that 5,000 men do not simply vanish. They knew that if there had been a victory, runners would have been sent. If there had been a defeat, survivors would have trickled back ragged, starving men telling tales of ambush. But there was nothing, only the silence. A silence that grew louder with each passing day. A silence that confirmed the impossible. The Ninth Legion was gone, not defeated, not retreating, but simply gone. The story of their fate was no longer one of military strategy or tactical error. It was becoming something else entirely, a ghost story, whispered around campfires for centuries to come. The legend of the Lost Legion had been born, but there were no survivors. That was the most terrifying aspect of the waiting. There was no straggler limping down the road. There was no wounded scout on a dying horse. There was only the void. The Ninth had walked into a room, and the door had been locked behind them. The atmosphere in Eberacum, modern-day York, grew heavy with dread. The wives of the centurions, proud women who had followed the eagle across the empire, began to wear mourning clothes, though no official death notices had been issued. They gathered at the shrines of the gods to Minerva, to Mars, to the local spirits. They lit oil lamps until the temples glowed with a desperate, flickering heat. They offered sacrifices, cakes, wine, locks of hair. Bring them back. Just bring them back. But the gods of the south seemed to have no power in the north. As winter approached, the weather turned vicious. Snow began to dust the tops of the hills. The wind howled around the stone towers of the fort, sounding like the voices of lost men. The realization began to settle in, cold and hard as the frost on the ground. The commander of the garrison stood on the northern wall one evening. He was an old man, a veteran who had seen too much war. He looked out at the vast, darkening landscape. The road north was a gray ribbon disappearing into the gloom. He knew, in his gut he knew, "They're not coming back," he whispered to the stone. It wasn't a sudden shock. It was a slow, crushing suffocation of hope. The waiting became a vigil. The daily routine of the fort continued, but it felt like a pantomime. The soldiers polished armor for a parade that would never happen. They guarded gates for a legion that would never return. A courier finally arrived from Rome, carrying messages for the legate of the Ninth Promotions, orders, news from the Senate. The garrison commander held the scroll in his hand, feeling the absurdity of it. He had orders for a ghost. He placed the scroll on a shelf, where it would gather dust alongside the others. The realization rippled through the empire slowly. It traveled down the roads to Londinium, then across the channel to Gaul, and finally to the marble heart of Rome. It was not announced with a shout, but with a confused murmur. "Where is the ninth?" The clerks in the Imperial Archive asked. "They are off the map. They are missing," the generals whispered in the strategy rooms. The word missing was worse than dead. Death is a fact. It has a body, a funeral, a closure. Missing is a haunting. It is an open wound that refuses to heal. It allows for the torture of hope. Maybe they are besieged. Maybe they are lost. Maybe they are marching back right now. But as the winter deep set in, sealing the mountain passes with snow, even the most hopeful had to accept the truth. No army could survive a Caledonian winter without supplies, without shelter, without contact. The anticipation turned into mourning. The forts of the north became quiet places, filled with the echoes of the men who had left. The barracks of the ninth stood empty, the straw mattresses collecting damp, the hearths cold. Personal items, a pair of dice, a carved wooden horse, a letter halfway written, remained on the shelves, frozen in time, waiting for owners who were now part of the soil in a nameless valley. The traders stopped bringing rumors, for there were no new rumors to bring. The story had ended. The silence was the final answer. In the town just outside the fort, a woman named Claudia, the wife of a first spear centurion, stood by the gate every evening at sunset. She did this for 3 months. She would stand wrapped in a gray wool cloak, watching the road. The guards knew her. They stopped telling her to go home. They simply nodded, respecting her vigil. One evening, as the snow began to fall, burying the road in white, she turned away. She blew out the lantern she carried. She didn't cry. She simply accepted the silence. She walked back into the town, leaving the gate to the empty night. The 9th Legion Hispana had become a legend. They had ceased to be men of flesh and blood, and had become a story to frighten children, a warning to emperors, and a mystery that would puzzle historians for millennia. The empire waited, but the north did not give them back. The eagle was gone. And in the south, the realization settled over the land like the winter snow. The frontier had moved. The line on the map had been drawn in blood, and the ninth was on the other side of it, lost forever in the mist of memory. The waiting was over. The haunting had begun. Time, like the mist of the north, has a way of softening sharp edges. The years rolled over the province of Britannia. Seasons turned. The heather bloomed purple on the moors, withered to brown in the winter, and bloomed again. The roads that the 9th Legion had marched upon were slowly reclaimed by the grass. The ruts left by their heavy wagons were filled with rain and smoothed by the wind. A decade passed, then another. The raw wound of the Legion's disappearance scabbed over, becoming a scar on the memory of the Empire. The sharp pang of loss felt by the mothers and wives in the South faded into a dull, lifelong ache. The names of the missing men were chiseled into cenotaphs, empty tombs for empty lives, and the world moved on. But the mystery remained. It sat on the northern horizon like a storm cloud that never broke. It was an unanswered question that gnawed at the Roman sense of order. Rome did not lose legions. Rome did not leave blanks on the map. In the year 122 AD, a new figure arrived to confront this silence. He was a man unlike the generals who had come before him. Publius Aelius Hadrianus, the Emperor Hadrian. He was not merely a soldier. He was a scholar, an architect, a traveler, and a stoic. He was a man who wore a beard in the Greek style, a man who looked at the world not just as a territory to be conquered, but as a structure to be understood. He came to Britannia not to launch a new invasion, but to inspect the edges of his world. He brought with him the full weight of the imperial court, a procession of administrators, engineers, and guards that stretched for miles. But as they traveled north, leaving the civilized villas of the south behind, the emperor grew quiet. He felt the change in the land. He felt the same atmospheric shift that the soldiers of the night had felt years before: the dampness, the brooding silence of the forest, the vast indifference of the sky. When Hadrian arrived at Eboracum, the old fortress of the Ninth, the ghosts were waiting for him. The Sixth Legion was stationed there now, but the shadow of their predecessors still hung over the stone walls. The emperor walked the ramparts in the gray light of the morning. He touched the cold stone. He looked north. Where did they go? He asked, though he knew there was no answer. The local commanders, old men now who had been young tribunes when the Ninth vanished, told him the stories. They spoke of the silence. They spoke of the lack of bodies. They spoke of the mist that swallowed armies. They showed him the maps that ended in blank parchment. Hadrian listened. He did not rage. He did not order a punitive expedition to burn the north. He was a pragmatist. He understood that the empire was an organism, and like any living thing, it had limits. It could only stretch so far before it tore. He decided to go further. He wanted to see the place where the world ended. The emperor and his personal guard rode north, following the ghost road of the Ninth. They rode past the abandoned marching camps, past the overgrown ditches where the Legion had slept its final nights. They rode into the teeth of the wind. Hadrian saw the landscape for what it was, a beautiful, hostile trap. He saw the glens that could hide 1,000 men. He saw the bogs that could swallow a horse whole. He realized that this was not a land worth the blood of Rome. There was no gold here. There were no great cities to tax. There was only rain, wool, and death. This journey wasn't a forensic investigation. Hadrian didn't expect to find the eagle rusting in a stream. He was searching for a conclusion. He was searching for the moral boundary of his dominion. He stopped at a high ridge, a spine of volcanic rock that runs from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. The wind here was ferocious. It tore at his red cloak, snapping it like a whip. He dismounted and stood on the precipice, looking north into the lands of the Caledonians. Standing there, feeling the biting wind and staring into the wild, endless expanse, Hadrian made a decision that would change the face of the Roman Empire forever. He wouldn't push further into this unforgiving land. He wouldn't waste more lives chasing ghosts. Instead, he would build a wall, a great stone barrier that would stretch from coast to coast. It would be a definitive statement. It would say, here, the empire ends. Here, the civilized world stops, and the wild begins. It was an admission of defeat, but also an act of profound wisdom. He chose to define his border, to protect what he had, rather than lose more in the pursuit of what he could not hold. And so, the mystery of the Ninth Legion wasn't solved with a battle, but with a wall that acknowledged the power of the North, the silence of the mist, and the ghosts of the lost legion. It was a view of infinite emptiness. The hills rolled away into the mist, wild and untamed. It was a landscape that rejected geometry. It rejected the straight line. The Roman Emperor Hadrian stood there for a long time. His generals stood behind him, shivering in the cold, waiting for the order to attack. They expected him to say, "Forward. Avenge them." But Hadrian turned to them, his face calm, his eyes reflecting the steel gray of the sky. "Enough," he said. The word was carried away by the wind, but its weight remained. "We will not chase ghosts," the emperor continued, his voice steady. "The Ninth is gone. The North has taken them. We will not feed it more." He looked down at the rocky earth beneath his feet. "If we cannot conquer the chaos, then we must wall it out. We will draw a line in the stone. Here Rome ends. Beyond this line is the other. We will separate the Romans from the barbarians." It was a monumental decision, an admission of mortality. For the first time, Rome was saying, "We stop here." The order was given. The search for the lost Ninth Legion was over. The sealing began. The construction of the wall was an act of exorcism. If they could not defeat the mystery, they would bury it behind stone. 3 legions, the 2nd, the 6th, and the 20th, were mobilized. But this time, they did not march to war. They marched to work. The sounds of the North changed. The silence was broken not by screams, but by the rhythmic clink-clink of chisels on stone. Quarries were opened. The earth was torn up. The landscape was forced to submit to Roman will. Not by sword, but by engineering. Day by day, month by month, the wall began to rise. It was a serpent of stone, stretching 80 Roman miles across the neck of the island. It was 10 feet wide and 15 feet high, topped with battlements. Every mile, a mile castle was built to house a garrison. Every third of a mile, a turret watched the horizon. The soldiers worked with a grim purpose. They knew what they were building. They were building a tombstone for their lost brothers. They were building a shield for themselves. Hadrian stayed to watch the beginning of the work. He walked the line, inspecting the foundations. He saw the sweat on the men's backs, the steam rising from the oxen, the mixing of the mortar. He saw civilization manifesting as a barrier. The wall was a masterpiece of intimidation. It was whitewashed with lime so that it gleamed in the sun, a shining white scar cutting across the green and brown of the landscape. To the tribes looking south from their hills, it was a message. You may have the myths, but we have the stone. You have the night, but we have the discipline. But for the Romans looking north, the wall served a different purpose. It was a blinder. It allowed them to stop looking into the dark. It allowed them to turn their backs on the mystery. As the wall grew higher, the view of the north was slowly cut off. The rolling hills where the ninth had vanished disappeared behind the masonry. The forests where the eyes watched were blocked from view. The soldiers standing guard on the finished sections felt a strange sense of relief. They were no longer exposed. They had a physical definition of safety. This side is us. That side is them. Hadrian eventually left Britannia. He traveled on to other provinces to build other monuments and secure other borders. But he left behind his greatest legacy, a line that defined the psychological geography of the island for centuries. The mystery of the Ninth Legion was not solved. It was sealed. The wall became the lid on the coffin. The story of the missing 5,000 men became a whisper told in the guard rooms of the Mile castles, a tale to keep sentries awake on long, cold nights. Don't look too long at the north, the veterans would tell the new recruits. Don't listen to the wind. That's where the ninth went. That's the land of ghosts. The wall created a permanent state of waiting. It was a static frontier. The dynamic, expansionist energy of the empire had hit the hard reality of the Caledonian wild and calcified into stone. In the evenings, when the sun set behind the western hills, the shadow of Hadrian's wall stretched long and dark over Roman territory. It was a protective shadow, but it was also a reminder of failure. The search was over. There would be no more expeditions into the mist. No more eagles would be risked. The empire had learned the hard lesson that the ninth had taught them with their lives, that there are places in the world that do not want to be conquered. The wind continued to blow from the north, carrying the scent of pine and rain, slamming against the north face of the wall. But the wall held. It stood as a silent sentinel, a guardian of the known world, separating the history of Rome from the eternal, misty mystery of the missing legion. The door was closed. The ghosts were on the other side. Stone is patient. Stone waits. While the lives of men are measured in heartbeats and seasons, the life of stone is measured in eras. Hadrian's Wall, that great ribbon of masonry that severed the island, stood for 3 centuries as the physical limit of the Roman world. But even stone eventually surrenders to time. The empire retreated. The garrisons left the Mile castles. The roof tiles slipped and shattered. The mortar, picked at by the relentless wind and the fingers of frost, turned to dust. The wall slumped into the earth, its sharp edges softened by moss and heather. The stones were carried away by farmers to build barns and by monks to build abbeys. Yet the line remained. The shadow remained. And trapped within that shadow was the echo of the Ninth Legion. As we reach the end of our journey, we must ask, what really happened? The mystery of the Ninth Legion Hispana is one of the most enduring riddles of antiquity. It is a puzzle with missing pieces, a story written in invisible ink. Historians and archaeologists have spent centuries digging through the soil of Britain, sifting through the archives of Rome, searching for a definitive answer. They look for the golden eagle. They look for the mass grave. They look for the final letter home. But the earth has been stingy with its secrets. There is a profound silence in the archaeological record. We know the Ninth was in York in 108 AD, helping to rebuild the fortress in stone. Their tile stamps are found there, baked into the red clay. And then, they vanish from the lists of the army. By the time a registry of legions was compiled later in the 2nd century, the Ninth was gone, erased. The lack of evidence is, in itself, the most haunting evidence of all. If 5,000 men had been slaughtered in a single open battle, there would be a field of bones. There would be armor, weapons, coins, the detritus of disaster. But in the deep glens of Scotland, the peat bogs hold their tongues. There is no great battlefield that has been found. This absence has allowed the legend to grow, filling the vacuum of facts with the vapors of myth. Some historians, the pragmatic detectives of the past, argue that there was no massacre in the myths. They suggest the Ninth was simply transferred. They point to brick stamps found in Nijmegen, in the Netherlands, or shadowy references to a unit serving in the East, perhaps destroyed in Judea or Armenia decades later. They argue for a slow, bureaucratic death, a unit disbanded, disgraced, or merged into others. But these are just theories written on paper. They lack the weight of the wind. They do not explain why the wall was built. Why did the greatest engineer emperor of Rome feel the sudden, desperate need to physically seal off the north? Why did he traverse the edge of the world to build a barrier if there was no great loss to avenge or prevent? The wall stands as a silent witness to a trauma. It suggests that something happened in the dark that shook the confidence of the empire to its core. The story we have followed, the march, the myths, the silence, is the story that the land remembers. It is the poetic truth. It is the version that is seeped into the folklore of the British Isles. Over the centuries, the Ninth Legion ceased to be a military unit and became a ghost story. In medieval halls, storytellers whispered of the Lost Legion. They spoke of phantom soldiers seen marching through the mist on the anniversaries of their disappearance. Shepherds in the hills would tell of hearing the faint, rhythmic tramp of hobnail boots on nights when the moon was hidden. A sound that had no source. The legend of the Ninth became a canvas upon which later generations painted their own fears of the unknown. It became a story about the hubris of civilization. Rome was the irresistible force, the machine of order and light. Caledonia was the immovable object, the realm of nature and old magic. When the machine broke against the wild, it created a myth that resonates even today. It reminds us that the map is not the territory. It reminds us that there are places where the road ends, where the modern world dissolves into the ancient. If you were to walk the path of the Ninth today, you would find a landscape that has barely changed. The shape of the hills is the same. The quality of the light in the twilight is the same. The silence is the same. The mystery endures because it speaks to something deep within us. The fear of being lost, of disappearing without a trace, and the profound, unsettling idea that not everything can be explained, conquered, or contained. Stand in a valley in the Cairngorms or the Trossachs when the low clouds descend. Close your eyes. Listen to the wind moving through the pine needles. It is a sound like the rushing of distant water, or perhaps the rushing of distant spirits. For over 2,000 years, a question has haunted the misty landscapes of northern Britain. What happened to the Ninth Legion? In the year 108 AD, the Legio IX Hispana, a force of nearly 5,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, marched north from their fortress at Ebercum, modern-day York. Their mission was to quell the rebellious tribes of Caledonia, what we now call Scotland. They marched into the mist and never returned. No records, no survivors, no definitive trace. They simply vanished from history. This is the story of the Lost Legion, not as a historical puzzle to be solved, but as a legend woven into the very fabric of the land. The artifacts of the Ninth, their swords, their helmets, their sandals, have long since rusted away. Iron returns to the earth as red oxide, becoming part of the soil that feeds the grass. The leather rots, becoming food for the beetles and the worms. The bones crumble into calcium, washing into the streams to be carried to the sea. Over centuries, the physical Ninth Legion has been completely metabolized by the landscape of Scotland, They are not in the land. They are the land. And what of the eagle? The aquila. That golden bird they died to protect, the sacred standard of the legion, the very symbol of Rome's power. It too was likely unmade. Perhaps it was melted down by a tribal smith, the gold hammered into torques and armbands for a chieftain's bride. The symbol of imperial Rome transformed into the jewelry of the free people of the north. What a beautiful, ironic fate. Or perhaps it lies there still, buried deep in a black peat bog, preserved in the anaerobic dark, waiting for a future that will never come. A silent golden secret held by the earth. But here's the thing. This mystery does not need to be solved to be felt. In fact, it is better unsolved. A solved mystery is just a fact, a line in a history book. But an unsolved mystery? That is a doorway. It is an invitation to wonder, to imagine, to dream. As the sun sets on our story, let's imagine the final fate of those men not as a violent end, but as a gentle fading. Imagine them marching still. They are marching in a place where time does not exist. They are marching through the eternal mist, their armor shining not with the gleam of polish, but with the pale light of the moon. They are no longer cold. They are no longer hungry. They are no longer afraid. They have become the guardians of the gray horizon, spectral sentinels of the Scottish Highlands. The Roman Empire fell. The stones of Eboracum were repurposed to build the glorious Minster of York. The language of Latin faded, evolving into the Romance tongues we speak today. The world changed 1,000 times over, but the Ninth Legion remains fixed in that one moment of departure. They are forever stepping off the edge of the map, forever walking into the unknown. They represent that ultimate human journey into mystery. So as you go about your day, or perhaps as you drift towards sleep tonight, let the image of the ninth comfort you. They are the companions of the quiet dark. They are the reminder that even when things are lost, they are not truly gone. They simply change form, they become stories, they become echoes. The wind blows over the ruins of Hadrian's Wall. It whistles through the gaps in the stone. If you listen closely, truly closely, you might hear it. Not a scream, not a battle cry, but a soft, rhythmic sound. Like the beating of a distant drum, like the steady marching of feet, like a lullaby of iron and earth. The search is over. The fires are out. The mist has claimed its own. We can let them rest now. Let the Legion sleep. Let the history fade into the dream. The ninth is safe in the keeping of the North, marching forever in the echoes of the stone. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the mist. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales from the edge of history. See you next time.